7. Broken loyalty. James' first class, ironically, was basic broom. The teacher was a giant slab of a man named Gabriel Ridcully. He wore a fawn-colored sport cloak over his Quidditch official's tunic, which displayed his enormous forearms and calves. "Good morning, first years," he boomed, and James guessed that Ridcully was one of the world's great morning people. "Welcome to Basic Broom. Most of you know me already, having seen me at the Quidditch matches and tournaments and whatnot. We'll be spending this year getting familiar with the fundamentals of flight. I believe in a very hands-on approach, so we'll all be jumping right into essential broom handling and control. Everyone approach your brooms, please." James had been dreading getting back onto a broom again, but as the class progressed, he found that, with proper guidance, he was able to manage getting his broom to levitate and support him, and even control its altitude and speed in very small formations. He realized that there were subtle variations in how the broom responded, based on speed and inclination. If the broom was merely hovering, leaning forward on the broomstick pressed it forwards, while pulling up drove it backwards. Once the broom was moving, however, those same controls began to also manage height. The faster the broom was moving, the more James' posture controlled altitude instead of speed. Finding the fine difference between a speed lean and an altitude lean was dependent entirely on the velocity of the broomstick at any given time. James sensed that the slightest panic would cause him to lose even the tiny degree of control he had already learned, and he began to understand why he'd been so dreadful during the Quidditch tryouts. As pleased as James was at his own tentative control of the broomstick, he still felt a shudder of jealousy when he saw Zane managing his broom through elaborate, effortless swoops and banks. "Let's avoid showboating, Mr. Walker," Ridcully called reproachfully, and James couldn't help feeling a petty surge of gratification. "Save it for the match tonight, why don't you?" Ralph's entire body was tensed as he struggled to stay atop his broom. He'd gotten it to float about 4 feet off the ground and seemed to be stuck there. "How do I get it to swoop like that?" he asked, watching Zane. James shook his head. "I'd just worry about staying right side up if I was you, Ralph." The rest of the morning's classes were far less interesting, with basic spell work and ancient runes. At lunch, James explained to Ralph and Zane the happenings of the night before. He told them about Franklin's daylight savings device, and the dinner conversation involving Madame Delacroix's voodoo powers. Finally, he explained the conversation he had heard between his dad and Professor Franklin, and how it fit in with the Austramatic's story about Merlin's predicted return. "So," Zane said, narrowing his eyes and staring thoughtfully at the wall behind James' head, "I am to understand that your dad has a cloak? That makes anyone who wears it invisible." James moaned, exasperated. "Yes. That's hardly the point, though, is it? Speak for yourself. I mean, forget X-ray specs. Just think what a guy could do with an invisibility cloak. Is it steam-resistant, do you think?" James rolled his eyes. "I don't think that the wizard who spent his lifetime creating the world's most perfect invisible garment did it to sneak into the girls' showers." "But you don't know that, do you?" Zane said, undeterred. Ralph chewed slowly, thinking. "So Franklin told your dad that there were wizards in the States who were pushing for the same thing as the progressive element? Muggle and wizard equality and all that?" James nodded. "Yeah, but it's all just a sham, isn't it? I mean, since when have Slytherins really wanted anything nice for the Muggle world? All the old pure-blood Slytherin houses have always been for going public, but just so they can take over the Muggle world and rule it. They think Muggles are an inferior species, not equals." Ralph looked oddly troubled. "Well, maybe. I don't know. Most of the people out in the courtyard the other day weren't even Slytherins, though. Did you notice that?" James hadn't, actually. "Doesn't really matter. It was the Slytherins that got the whole thing started, with the progressive element slogans and badges and stuff. You said so yourself, Ralph. Tabitha Corsica was handing the badges out to all the Slytherins. She's behind the whole thing. I don't think she's in on it like you think she is, Ralph said, with this whole bringing Merlin back from the dead plot and all that. She just thinks we should be fair to everybody, Muggle and Wizard alike. She's not trying to start a war or anything stupid. I mean, really, it doesn't seem fair that we shouldn't be able to work in the Muggle world, does it? Or compete in Muggle games and sports. Just because we have magic on our side doesn't make us outcasts. You sound just like one of them, James said angrily. Well? Ralph said suddenly, his face going red. I am one of them, if you haven't noticed. And I don't appreciate the way you're talking about my house. Things are a lot different now than they were when your dad went here. If you're so worried about truth and history, you should be all for debate on the subject. Maybe Tabitha's right about you. James sat back, his mouth dropping open. Ralph lowered his eyes. She wants me to be in the first school debate with Team A. I assume you know the topic. They're calling it reevaluating the assumptions of the past, truth or conspiracy. And you're going to be on the team, then? You're going to argue that my dad and his chums made the whole Voldemort story up just to scare people into keeping the wizarding world a secret. Ralph looked miserable. Nobody believes your dad made it up, but... He didn't seem to know how to finish the sentence. Well, James cried, throwing up his hands. Great argument, then. I'm speechless. Tabitha sure has a great partner in you, hasn't she? But maybe your dad wasn't on the right side after all. Ralph said hotly. Has that ever occurred to you? I mean, sure, people got killed. It was a war. But why is it that when your side killed people, it was a triumph of good, but when their side killed, it was an evil atrocity? The victors write the history books, you know. Maybe the truth of the whole affair has been skewed. How would you know? You weren't even born yet. James threw his fork down onto the table. I know my dad, he shouted. He didn't kill anyone. He was on the right side, because my dad is a good man. Voldemort was a bloodthirsty monster who just wanted power and was willing to kill anyone who got in his way, even his friends. You might want to remember that. Since you seem to be choosing to side with people like him. Ralph stared at James and swallowed. James knew, in some small, distant part of his mind, that he was overreacting. Ralph was Muggle-born. Everything he knew about Voldemort and Harry Potter, he'd only read in the last 2 weeks. Besides, Ralph was being fed all this by his housemates, who he was desperate to get along with. Still, James was furious to the point of wanting to hit him, mostly because he didn't dare hit any of the Slytherins who were directly responsible for the malicious, self-serving lies about his dad. James broke eye contact first. He heard Ralph gather his books and backpack. Well, Zane said tentatively, I was going to see if you two wanted to meet after the match tonight for butterbeers with the gremlins, but maybe I'll just take a rain check, eh? Neither Ralph nor James spoke. After a moment, Ralph walked away. You were pretty horrible to him, you know, Zane said evenly. Me? James exclaimed. Before you defend yourself, Zane said, raising a hand in a conciliatory gesture, just let me say, you're right. Of course, it's all a load of crap. But it's Ralph. He's just trying to get along. You know? No, James said flatly, not when getting along means talking up a bunch of lies about my dad. He doesn't know they're lies, Zane said reasonably. He's just a guy hearing all this for the first time. He wants to believe you, but he also wants to fit in with his house. Too bad for him they're all a bunch of whacked out, power-crazed lunatics. James felt slightly mollified. He knew Zane was right, But he still couldn't quite regret his outburst against Ralph. So, you're just a new guy hearing all this for the first time, too. Why aren't you running off to join the progressive element and chant slogans? Because lucky for you, Zane said, throwing an arm around James' neck, I got sorted into Ravenclaw, and they all hated old Voldy just as much as you Gryffindors. Besides, he looked slightly wistful, I happen to think Petra Morgenstern is, on the whole, just a little bit hotter than Tabitha Corsica. James elbowed Zane away from him, groaning. They both went to the library for study period. Knossos Shirt, the ancient runes professor, was monitoring the period, his thick glasses and long, skinny limbs in green robes making him look rather like a praying mantis seated behind the library head desk. Zane was copying arithmancy theorems, frowning as he worked them out. James, not wanting to disturb him, but equally disinterested in embarking on his own homework, pulled the morning's copy of the Daily Prophet out of his backpack, where he'd stuffed it at breakfast. He glanced at the lead articles again, pressing his lips together in disgust. Near the bottom of the front page, James was annoyed to see a picture of Tabitha Corsica. She looked like she always did, reasonable, thoughtful, and polite. Hogwarts prefect discusses progressives movement on campus, the headline next to her picture read. Knowing he shouldn't read it, James glanced at a random couple of lines in the middle of the article. Of course, my house doesn't believe in disturbing the harmony of the school for these discussions, but we respect the members of other houses as they voice their concerns, Miss Corsica explained, her eyes full of regret for the disruptions of the day. But obviously recognizing the validity of her fellow students' motivations. Despite the headmistress' reluctance to be clear about the debate schedule, I am confident that we will be allowed to forge ahead with our plan to foster a discussion about your practices and policies, and the assumptions those are based on. In an open and free-ranging debate format. Miss Corsica, a fifth-year Slytherin, is also captain of her Quidditch team. I had my broomstick fashioned by Muggle artisans, she explains shyly. They had no idea of the magical properties of the wood, and of course, I had it registered by the school as a Muggle artifact. But still, I just thought it would be nice to experience something handmade by our Muggle friends. It also happens to be one of the fastest brooms on the pitch, she adds, biting her lip modestly, but I credit that to the hands that made it, as much as to the spells that infuse the wood. James picked up the paper and flipped it over angrily, slapping it onto the table and earning a loud hush from Professor Shirt. He stared unseeingly at the back of the paper. How could anyone believe such obviously contrived drivel? Tabitha Corsica and her special order Muggle-made broom were just the icing on the cake, and she knew it. When James had seen her in the courtyard, Tabitha had been giving her interview with Rita Skeeter. James remembered the breathless eagerness on Skeeter's face as her quill danced across the parchment. Stupid, gullible woman, James thought. Still, apparently she was just being true to herself and her readership. James had been told about his dad's first encounters with Skeeter, back during the Triwizard Tournament. And Hermione had caught on to the secret that Rita Skeeter was an unregistered animagus, her animal form being that of a beetle. Eventually, Hermione had captured Skeeter in her beetle form, preventing her, for a time, from continuing her assault on the truth via her articles in the Daily Prophet. This morning, however, Harry had told James that the way to fight for the truth was not to argue with people like Rita Skeeter. Frankly, James preferred Aunt Hermione's methods to those his dad claimed to espouse these days. As he ruminated on this, James' eye roamed unseeingly over the headlines and pictures on the back of the paper. Suddenly, however, one headline caught his attention. He leaned over it, his brow furrowing. Ministry break-in remains a mystery. London. Last week's burglary of the Ministry of Magic headquarters leaves orators and officials alike baffled, as questions still surface about the burglars' motives and the possibility of inside accomplices. As reported by this news organ early last week, 3 individuals of questionable backgrounds were arrested on the morning of Monday, August 31st, related to a break-in and ransacking of several departments of the Ministry of Magic. The 3 alleged burglars, 2 humans and a goblin, were found during a search of the surrounding area hours after the break-in was discovered. Upon the realization that the individuals had fallen under the Langlock jinx, rendering them incapable of responding to interrogation, all 3 were sent under guard to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. A search of the ransacked departments, which included the Department of International Magical Cooperation, the Currency Conversion Office, and the Department of Mysteries, however, revealed no apparently missing objects or monies. The criminal charges were subsequently reduced to destruction of property and trespassing, and the story, while curious, was dismissed until late last week, when it became known that no amount of counter curses or jinxes were having any effect on the Langlocked accused. These are remarkably powerful curses, involving a not insubstantial degree of dark magic charm work, said Dr. Horatio Flack, head of the Counter Jinx facility at St. Mungo's. If we are unable to release the curse on these men by this weekend, I am afraid the spells may become permanent. As it turns out, one of the accused, identified to this reporter as the Goblin, a Mr. Fickley's Bissell of Sussex, did begin to respond to the counter jinxes over the course of the weekend. He was making sounds and grunts, getting rather close to actual words, reported one of his nurses, who asked to remain anonymous. Shortly after dawn this morning, however, Mr. Bissell was found dead in his room, apparently the victim of a mislabeled medication. This has sparked a wide range of speculation, resulting in a renewed investigation into the break-in. Corina Green, lead investigator for the case, was quoted as saying, "We are now primarily concerned with ascertaining how, exactly, these 3 individuals were able to gain entry into ministry offices. These are small-time crooks, none having ever attempted something of this magnitude in the past. We cannot rule out the likelihood of outside help, or even a ministry insider." The death of Mr. Bissell, however, while suspicious, is still being ruled as an accident. "We can only be thankful," Ms. Green added, "that the thieves apparently failed in their efforts, seeing that nothing has apparently gone missing." "Come on," Zane whispered, startling James out of his reading. "I'm gonna sneak out early so I can get in some practice time on the broom. Want to come along? I could use a potter for good luck." James decided it would be good to swallow his pride and tagged along with Zane. He even thought he might spend a little practice time on a broom himself. He folded the newspaper again and stuffed it into his backpack. "Think you can show me how to do that hard stop and spin I saw you pulling in basic broom class today?" James asked Zane as they pounded up the stairs to change out of their robes. "Sure, mate," Zane agreed confidently. "Just don't show it to Ralph until he can keep his broom under him while he's floating still." James felt an ugly pang at the mention of Ralph's name, but he pushed it away. Minutes later, changed into jeans and T-shirts, the 2 of them ran exuberantly out into the sunlight of the afternoon, heading toward the Quidditch pitch. James spent the afternoon on the pitch with Zane, practicing his broom handling a little, but mostly just watching the Ravenclaw and Gryffindor teams assemble and run drills. When Zane joined his team to grab some quick dinner and get into their gear, James accompanied Ted and the Gryffindors back to the common room as they changed and headed down to dinner themselves. The atmosphere before the first match of the season was always charged with excitement. The Great Hall was raucous with good-natured teasing, shouts and impromptu outbursts of house anthems. During dessert, Noah, Ted, Petra, and Sabrina, all dressed in their Quidditch jerseys, lined up along the front of the Gryffindor table, arms linked and grinning like they were about to perform a show tune. In unison, they stomped their feet on the stone floor, garnering the room's attention, then launched into a roughly choreographed but enthusiastic Irish jig, singing a tune Damien had written for them earlier that day. "So, we Gryffindors like to make jokes and have fun. But the Quidditch pitch with us will be overrun," and we hope that the Ravenclaws know that they're done, when the Lion team drops down on them like a ton. So, the game can be tough, and the body check's harsh, and you might find your seekers been tossed in the marsh, but we Gryffindors with our goodwill are not sparse, so we'll warn you before we kick you in the... The last words were drowned out by the mingled roars and cheers of the Gryffindors and the boos and catcalls of the Ravenclaws. The gremlins bowed deeply, grinning, obviously pleased with themselves, and then joined their teammates as they ran out to the Quidditch pitch for final preparations. The first and last matches of the Quidditch season, as James knew, were always the best attended. At the end of the year, during final tournaments, everyone knew that, whichever teams were playing, they'd be exciting matches. At the beginning of the year, though, people were excited and hopeful for their own house teams. Most matches saw the grandstands filled with students and teachers, decked out in their team colors and waving flags and banners. As James entered the pitch, he was delighted to see and hear the enthusiastic crowd. Students milled and shouted to each other as they filed into their seats. The teachers mostly sat at the tops of the sections dedicated to their houses. As James climbed the stairs into the Gryffindor section, he saw his dad seated near the press box, flanked by the ministry officials on his right and the Alma Dalaran delegation on his left. Harry saw James and waved him up, smiling broadly. As James reached him, Harry orchestrated a complicated rearrangement of the seating that, while only freeing a single seat for James, required nearly everyone in the group to move. James mumbled apologies, but didn't really mind seeing the look of annoyance on Miss Saccharina's face, masked thinly by her omnipresent plastic smile. As I was saying, yes, we do have Quidditch in the States, Professor Franklin said to Harry, his voice carrying over the dull roar of the assembling crowd, but for some reason, it isn't quite as popular as sports like Swivenhodge, Grungeball, or Broomstick Gauntlet. Our World Cup team shows some promise this year, though, or so I am told. I tend to remain skeptical. James glanced around at the Americans, curious to see who was in attendance and what they seemed to think of the match so far. Madame Delacroix was seated on the end of the row, her face expressionless and her hands folded tightly on her lap so that they looked unpleasantly like a ball of brown knuckles. Professor Jackson glanced at James and nodded in greeting. James saw that his black leather case, with its inexplicable cargo, was sitting between his feet, securely closed this time. Professor Franklin was dressed in what passed for his dress robes, with a high white collar and a frilly ascot at his throat, and his square spectacles which caught the light cheerfully as he looked around the grandstands. "Where's Ralph?" Harry asked James. "I thought I'd see him with you tonight." James shrugged noncommittally, avoiding his dad's eyes. "Bob." "Here we are," Franklin announced, sitting up and craning to watch. The Gryffindor team streaked out of the broad doorway at the base of their grandstand, their red cloaks snapping behind each flyer like a flag. The Gryffindor squadron, led by Captain Justin Kennelly, is first to take the pitch, Damien Damascus' voice rang out stoutly from the press box. The team pulled into a corkscrew formation that tightened as it rose, and then yanked their brooms to a halt as the players formed a large letter G right in front of the Gryffindor section of the grandstands. Then the shape dissolved as the players broke formation, dodging around one another in a dizzying bout of aerial acrobatics, and reformed into the letter P. All the players sat up straight on their brooms, faced Harry and James, and saluted, grinning broadly. The Gryffindor grandstand applauded wildly, deafeningly, and James saw dozens of smiling and shouting faces turning to view Harry's reaction. He waved and nodded, curtly, half standing to receive the accolade. "You'd think the Queen was in attendance," James heard Harry mutter as he sat back down. "And now, here come the Ravenclaws," Damien called, his voice echoing around the pitch. Headed by Captain Jennifer Tellis, fresh from last year's tournament victory. The Ravenclaw team burst from the opposite side of the grandstand like fireworks, each flyer pulling off into a different direction, weaving through each other and tossing a quaffle from player to player with speed that defied the eye. After several seconds of spiraling wildly and apparently randomly around the grandstands, the Ravenclaws streaked simultaneously into the center of the pitch, pulled to a sudden stop, then spun on their broomsticks to face the crowd in all directions. Each player raised their right arm, and Jennifer, in the center, held the quaffle over her head. There was wild cheering from the Ravenclaw grandstand, and cheers of appreciation and respect from the rest. Finally, Jennifer and Justin flew into position in the center of the pitch, nodding greetings as the teams took up formation behind their captains. Beneath them, standing in the center mark of the pitch in his official's tunic, Gabriel Ridcully held the quaffle under his arm, his foot resting on the Quidditch trunk. "I want to see a clean match," he called up to the players. "Captains, ready? Players in formation? And..." He hefted the quaffle in his massive palm, arm outstretched. "Quaffle in play." Ridcully heaved the quaffle straight up and simultaneously lifted his foot from the Quidditch trunk. The trunk sprang open, releasing the two bludgers and the snitch. All four balls shot upwards, merging with the players as they exploded into motion. The grandstands erupted into cheers and wild shouting. James remembered to look for Zane among the Ravenclaws. His blonde hair wasn't hard to find against the royal blue of his cloak. He spun through a knot of players, executing a surprisingly tight barrel roll, then leaned precariously and backhanded a bludger as it banked around the group. The bludger missed its target, but only because Noah ducked and rolled aside at just the right moment. The crowd roared in mingled delight and disappointment. The heat of the summer evening was unusually fierce. The lowering sun beat down on players and spectators alike. On the ground, both teams had marked out team cool-down areas, one at each end of the pitch. Each area held a dozen large buckets filled with water. Occasionally, a flyer would perform a wand signal, alerting the team's cool-down crew. One member of the crew would use his wand to levitate the water out of one of the buckets, so that it floated 30 feet over the pitch like a solid, wobbling bubble. Then, just as the flyer swooped into position, another crew member would point his wand at the levitating ball of water, exploding it into a cloud of droplets just as the player flew through it. The crowd laughed delightedly every time a player emerged from the rainbow-laden mist, shaking water from their hair and joining the fray again, happily refreshed. Gryffindor took the lead early on, but Ravenclaw began a steady comeback that stretched into the evening. The sun was setting by the time Ravenclaw overtook Gryffindor, and the match took on that feverish, hectic tone that only very close games can sustain. James watched the Seekers, trying to get a glimpse of the elusive snitch, but he couldn't see any sign of the tiny golden ball. Then, just as he looked away, there was a flash of setting sunlight on something over the Hufflepuff grandstand. James squinted, and there it was, flitting in and out of the banner poles. The Ravenclaw team's Seeker had already seen it. James shouted to Noah, the Gryffindor Seeker, jumping to his feet and pointing. Noah spun around on his broom, looking wildly. He saw the snitch just as it angled down, directly into the melee of circling flyers and careening bludgers. The Ravenclaw Seeker lunged as the snitch streaked past him. He almost fell off his broom, turned the fall into a diving loop, and doubled back toward the match. Ted, one of Gryffindor's beaters, aimed a bludger at Ravenclaw Seeker, making the boy duck and weave, but not deterring him from his course. Noah was approaching from the other side of the field, ducking and banking wildly through the other flyers. The rest of the crowd caught on to what was happening. As one, the spectators leaped to their feet, shouting and cheering. And then, just at the very height of the action, James saw something else that completely distracted him from the match for the first time since it had begun. The Muggle intruder was down on the field, standing just to the side of the Ravenclaw cool-down area. James could hardly believe he was seeing it, but the man was simply standing, wearing a cast-off cloak from one of the cool-down crew, staring up into the match with an expression of total awe and bewilderment. He was holding something to his eye, and James recognized vaguely that it was some sort of handheld Muggle camera, He was filming the match. James tore his gaze away from the intruder and looked up at his dad, who stood next to him, shouting happily at the end of game brawl. James yanked Harry's robes and yelled up at him. "Dad! Dad, there's someone down there." He pointed wildly, trying to indicate the Quidditch pitch through the throng of standing, waving spectators. Harry looked at James, still smiling, trying to hear. "What?" he yelled, leaning toward James. "Down there," James shouted, still pointing. "He's not supposed to be here. He's a muggle. I've seen him here before." Harry's face changed instantly. The smile snapped shut. Harry stood up to his full height and scanned the field. James glanced back down as well, searching for the muggle intruder. He was sure he'd be gone and that James would be left looking like a fool, but the man was still there, staring up into the melee above. He had lowered his camera, James saw it. It dangled from his right hand. James looked closer and saw that the man had bandages on his upper arm, and smaller bandages taped to 2 places on his face. He had gotten hurt crashing through the stained glass window, but apparently not hurt enough to avoid coming back. Harry was pushing past the American delegation, excusing himself politely but firmly, heading toward the stairs. James followed, trotting to keep up. Together, they traversed the stairs 2 by 2, heading down to field level. James recognized that his dad was in full order mode now, not thinking, really, but letting instinct take over. There was no sense of panic or worry or anger, just businesslike purpose and unstoppability. Harry reached the field, with James right behind him just as the game ended. There was a thunderous ovation, and suddenly people were running onto the field. The cool-down crews came out to collect the empty buckets. The teams began to come in for landings, dropping to the pitch like dandelion seeds. GRETEL strode across the center line, using his wand to summon the game balls. Undeterred, Harry walked purposefully toward the end of the field where he and James had seen the strange man, but now that they were on the pitch, they couldn't see him anymore. There were too many people moving about, too much noise and confusion. James knew that there were 100 ways the man could already have slunk away, disappearing into the spreading shadows of the hills and woods beyond the pitch. Harry didn't stop moving until he stood on the spot they'd seen the man standing. He turned slowly, taking in the sights from what would have been the man's perspective. "There," he pointed. James looked and saw that his dad was pointing at the base of one of the grandstands, at the doorway leading into the Ravenclaw's holding pen. Or there, Harry said, talking partly to James and partly to himself, indicating first the path that ran between the Hufflepuff and Slytherin grandstands and then pointing at the equipment shed. He probably wouldn't choose the shed, since he'd know there was no back way out. At best, it's a hiding place, and he'd be looking to get away, not hide. The grandstand exit would just take him farther in. No, he'd choose the path, then. It's only been 2 minutes. "James?" James looked up at his dad, eyes wide. "Yeah. Tell the headmistress what we saw and have Titus meet me at the entrance to that path in 5 minutes. Don't run. We don't know what this is about, and we don't need to cause any concern yet. Just walk fast and tell them what I said. Okay?" James nodded briskly, and then turned back the way he and his dad had come, reminding himself not to run. As he climbed the steps, pressing through the departing crowd, not even knowing yet who'd won the match, he realized how utterly gratified he was that his dad had believed him. In some small part of his mind, James had been worried that his dad would doubt him, perhaps even dismiss his concerns. But James had counted on the hope that his dad knew him better than that his dad would trust him. Harry had done just that, descending to the field to investigate the strange man without any question or hesitation. Of course, that was how orders worked. Investigate first, then ask questions if any are required. Still, James was extremely glad that his dad had trusted him enough to go after the man based solely on James' word. Despite his relief at his dad's response, however, James was sorely disappointed that the man had gotten away so easily. Somehow, he knew that Harry and Titus would not find any sign of the man or any clue of where he'd gone. Then, James would be right back where he'd started, with nothing but the glimpse of an unknown person on the Quidditch pitch to back up his story. Thinking that, he finally caught up to Titus Hardcastle and the rest of the group. When he gave them his messages from Harry, Titus excused himself with a word and headed briskly down the stairs, his hand in the pocket he kept his wand in. McGonagall and the ministry officials listened to James' explanation of the man he and Harry had seen on the field, the headmistress with a look of stern attentiveness, Miss Saccharina, and Mr. Recreant with looks of mild puzzlement. "You say he had some sort of camera, dear boy?" Saccharina asked mildly. "Yeah, I've seen them before. It makes movies. He was filming the match." Saccharina looked at Recreant with a strange expression that James took for disbelief. He wasn't surprised, and he didn't really care. He was more concerned that McGonagall believe him. He was about to tell her the man was the same man that he'd accidentally kicked through the window, but something about the expression on Saccharina's face made him decide to wait until they were in private. On the way down the steps again, flanked by McGonagall, the ministry officials, and the Alma Ballerons, James finally heard the score. It turned out that Ravenclaw had won the game. James felt annoyed and deflated, but he took some comfort in knowing that at least Zane was probably having a good evening. When they reached the path leading back to the castle, Headmistress McGonagall sidestepped out of the line. "Professors and guests, please feel free to return to the castle on your own. I prefer to attend to this situation in person," she said briskly and turned to cross the field. James darted to follow her. When he caught up with her, she glanced down at him. "I suppose it would be pointless for me to tell you this is no business of a first-year student," she said, apparently choosing, against her better judgment, not to send James up to the castle. "The Auror in charge being your father, he'd probably ask for you to be there, no less. One wonders how he is able to keep his head on straight without Miss Granger to reel him in." It took James a moment to realize Miss Granger was Aunt Hermione, whose last name was now Weasley. He couldn't help smiling at the thought that the headmistress still tended to think of his dad and aunt and uncle as troublesome, if generally likable, little kids. By the time they reached the head of the path that cut between the Slytherin and Hufflepuff grandstands, Harry and Titus Hardcastle were coming back from their cursory examination of the area. McGonagall spoke first. "Any sign of the intruder?" "Nothing so far," Hardcastle said gruffly. "Too dry for footprints and too dark to pick up his trail without a team or a dog." "Madam Headmistress," Harry said, and James could tell his dad was still in Auror mode, "may we have your permission to conduct a broader search of the area? We'd require the help of a small crew of our choosing." "You believe that this individual is a threat?" the headmistress asked Harry before answering. Harry spread his hands and shrugged. "There's no way of knowing without more information. But I do know that the man I saw was too old to be a student, nor did I recognize him as any of the faculty or staff. He was wearing a cloak from one of the ground crew as an attempt at disguise, so he was certainly hiding from someone, if not everyone. And James tells me he's seen this person on the grounds before." Everyone looked at James. "He's the one I told you about the other morning, ma'am," James explained, addressing the headmistress. "I'm sure of it. He had bandages on his arm and face. I think he got hurt when I knocked him through the window." "I knew that would be an interesting story," Harry muttered, suppressing a smile. "But certainly, Mr. Potter, Mr. Hardcastle," McGonagall said, looking at the adults, "you realize there is no conceivable way that anyone could overcome the protective perimeter of the school. Anyone you saw simply must have been permitted to be on the grounds, otherwise." "You're right, Minerva," Harry said. but the individual I saw didn't act as if he believed he was permitted to be here. So the question is, if he's been allowed in, who gave the permission, and how? These are questions I'd very much like to ask, but our only hope of doing so rests on our beginning a search of the grounds immediately. McGonagall met Harry's eyes, nodded reluctantly, then more certainly. Of course. Who do you require? I'd like Hagrid, for starters. No one knows these grounds like him, and of course, we'll want Trife. We'd like to split into 3 teams, Hagrid with Trife, myself leading a team into the Forbidden Forest, and Titus heading the other team around the perimeter of the lake. We'll need more sets of eyes to watch for sign. Too bad Neville is away tonight. We could summon him back, Hardcastle commented. Harry shook his head. I don't think that's necessary. We're looking for a single individual, possibly a muggle. All we really need are a couple people who know how to spot a trail. How about Teddy Lupin and you, James? James tried not to look too pleased, but a thrill of pride went through him. He nodded at his dad with what he hoped looked like duty and confidence, instead of giddy excitement. Does the school keep any hippogriffs at the moment, madam? Titus rumbled. A view from above is what's called for here. If the man's been on the grounds before, he must be camped out nearby. No, none at the moment, Mr. Hardcastle. We have thestrals, of course. Harry shook his head. Too light. Thestrals can only carry 1 person, and none as heavy as Titus or myself. Hagrid would break one right in half. James was thinking hard. How high do you have to be? Hardcastle looked sideways at James. Higher than man height's really all that matters. High enough to get a bird's eye view of the ground, but slow enough to be able to study it. You've an idea? Spill it, son. What about giants? James said after a pause. He was worried it was a stupid idea. Mostly, he was afraid of losing the respect his dad had shown him by inviting him along on the search. There's Grop, who's tall as some trees, and his new lady friend. Hagrid says she's even bigger than your regular giant. Hardcastle glanced at Harry, his expression unreadable. Harry looked considering. How fast do you think Hagrid can get them here? He asked, addressing the question to the headmistress. That's certainly a question worth asking, she said, a little largely, seeing as I had no idea we now had 2 giants living among us. I'll go and request their services from Hagrid personally. She turned to James. Go and fetch Mr. Lupin, and tell no one what you are up to. Both of you meet your father at Hagrid's cottage with cloak and wand within 15 minutes. I'll need to return to the castle to see to our guests. And James, Harry said, smiling that crooked smile, now, you can run. James was out of breath by the time he reached the common room. He found Ted still in his Quidditch jersey, moping with several other players in a corner alcove. Ted, come here. James called, catching his breath. We don't have much time. That's no way to enter a room, Sabrina said, turning to look at James over the back of the couch. One might get the rather inescapable impression that you were up to something. I am. We are, James said, leaning forward, his hands on his knees. But I can't tell you right now. Not allowed to. Afterwards. But they want you, Ted. We're supposed to be at Hagrid's cabin in 5 minutes. Wand and cloak. Ted jumped up, apparently happy to forget the first loss of the season and always ready to tag along for an adventure. Well, we all knew this day would come. Finally, my unique skills and insight are being recognized. We'll regale you with the story of our adventure, assuming we live to tell the tale. Lead on, James. Ted stuffed his wand into his pocket and slung his cloak over his shoulder. As both boys strode through the portrait hole, James still panting, Ted strutting, and rock-jawed, Sabrina called after them, bring more butterbeers when you get back, oh mighty ones. On the way around the balcony, James was dismayed to see Zane wave at him from across the stairwell. He detoured to meet them at the landing. "Hey, Ted, great game." Ted growled, annoyed to be reminded of it. "Where you going?" Zane asked, trotting to keep up with James and Ted. "Adventure and mortal peril, I'm thinking," Ted replied. "You want to come?" "Yeah." "What's the plan?" "No," James exclaimed. "Sorry. I'm not supposed to tell anyone about it, but Ted. My dad said." Zane's eyebrows shot up. "Your dad? Cool. Serious or stuff? Come on, you can't run off to have Harry Potter-style adventures without your buddy Zane, can you?" James stopped in the main hall, exasperated. "All right. You can follow us out, but if Dad says you have to come back in and be quiet about it, you have to. All right?" "Woohoo!" Zane called, running ahead of them down the steps into the courtyard. "Come on, you guys. Adventure and really wild stuff awaits." Harry and Titus Hardcastle were standing outside Hagrid's cabin with their wands lit by the time the three boys arrived. "Thanks for coming, Ted," Harry said, his face stoic. "And Zane, as well, who I hadn't exactly expected." "I asked him to come, Harry," Ted said, affecting a grave expression. "He's new, but he's sharp. I thought he might be of service, depending on what you're planning." Ted studied Zane critically. Zane wiped the grin off his face and attempted to look serious, without much success. Harry studied them both. "Mainly, we just need eyes. Since Zane has as many of those as the rest of us, I guess he's qualified. Let's just hope Minerva doesn't find out I took another first year into the forest, or she'll bloody well figure out a way to give us all detention." "James hasn't told you what we're doing here tonight." Ted shook his head. "Nary a word. Just said it was top secret, hush-hush stuff." Harry slid an eye toward James. "The headmistress told you not to say anything, my boy." "I didn't," James protested, shooting a look at Ted. "I just said I wasn't allowed to tell anyone what we were doing." "Best way to get people suspicious, James, is to tell them not to ask." But Harry didn't seem angry. In fact, he seemed a little amused. "No matter, though. We'll be done and back to the castle before your gremlin friends mount any kind of reconnaissance. Right, Ted?" "They're probably tucked into their beds, even as we speak, Godfather," Ted said primly. Harry rolled his eyes. James became aware of a dull rumbling underfoot. Moments later, he heard the distant barking of Trife, Hagrid's bullmastiff, who had long since succeeded his beloved boarhound, Fong. Everyone present turned toward the woods as the rumbling underfoot became a rhythmic pounding. After a minute, huge shapes loomed in the darkness, lumbering between the trees, their footfalls shaking the ground. Trife bounded in and out of the giant's legs, apparently unfazed by the fact that he'd be squashed to putty if one of them accidentally stepped on him. He barked up at them excitedly, his normally substantial frame dwarfed by the plodding figures. Hagrid followed, occasionally calling at Trife to quiet down, but with no real conviction. Gronk was easy to bring along, Hagrid called, stepping out of the forest. "He always wants to help. Got himself a great big heart, though, gold, he does. Getting better and better with his words, too. His lady friend, though." He dropped his voice as he approached Harry, affecting a secretive pose that James thought was about as subtle as a banshee in a matchbox. "She's not quite so used to being around folks as Grot is. Didn't take too well to being woken up, either. Barely understands a word we say, but it seems best just to keep on talking to her as if she does. She'll come along all right, so long as we take it slow with her." James reminded himself that this was the same Hagrid who had raised blast-ended Scroots for fun, and persisted in thinking that the primary characteristic of dragons was their cuteness. Any warning from Hagrid about a creature's temperament, therefore, was definitely worth hearing. Everyone turned to greet the giants as they emerged from the trees. Grok came first, blinking and smiling in the wand light. He waved a piano-sized hand at Harry. "Hello, Harry," Grop's voice was deep and slow. James had the impression that making words wasn't quite what it had been designed for. "How Hermione down?" "Hermione." Harry tried to save Grop the effort. "Hermione is fine, Grop. She would say hello if she had known I'd be seeing you." This seemed to be more than Grop could quite wrap his mind around. "Hello, Hermione." He continued working through Hermione's name as the she-giant emerged tentatively from the forest behind him. James craned his neck, feeling an involuntary thrill of fear course down his spine. The she-giant was so tall that she had to push the canopy of the trees apart as she stepped out of the forest, cracking and snapping branches. The wand light only reached her chest, which was roughly about the same height as Grop's head. Her head was merely a shadowed shape moving above the treetops, outlined against the starry sky. She moved slower than Grop, ponderously, her great feet coming down to the ground like falling millstones, shaking leaves from the nearby trees with each step. "So much for stealth," Hardcastle commented, staring up at the monstrous figure. "Harry, Titus, James, Zane, and Ted," Hagrid called out very slowly, "meet Prechka." "Prechka, these are friends." Prechka bent down slightly so that her head hovered over Grop's shoulder. She made a low, interrogative grunt that James thought actually rattled the windows in Hagrid's cottage. Harry raised his lit wand over his head and smiled. "Prechka, Grop, thank you both for coming and helping us. We won't keep you long, I hope. Hagrid has explained what we are asking you to do tonight, has he?" Grok gathered himself to speak. "Harry, look for sneaking man. Grop and Prechka help." "Excellent," Harry said, turning to address the group. "Hagrid, you take Trife and get him on the scent from the path. See if he can pick up anything leading off the trail into the forest or around the lake. If so, send up a red signal. Ted, you'll be with me and Prechka in the forest. Zane, James, you'll both join Titus and Grop searching the perimeter of the lake. We're searching for a back trail as much as we're looking for the intruder himself, so watch for broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and ground leaves, and anything human-related, such as bits of cloth, trash, papers, or anything of that nature. Everyone clear?" "Who are we looking for, Harry?" Ted asked. Harry was already approaching Prechka slowly. "We'll know that when we find him, won't we?" 8. The Grotto Keep. Zane, James, and Hardcastle climbed onto Grop's back as the giant squatted down. James and Zane both clambered onto his shoulder, gripping Grop's ragged shirt for support. Hardcastle, apparently oblivious to how ridiculous it might look, straddled the back of Grop's neck like a kid being carried by his dad. He held his lit wand up and out, spreading a halo of light onto the ground around them, and then directed Grop toward the lake. As they left, Harry and Ted were still working out the best method to get onto Prechka's shoulders. "Do we need a ladder, you think?" Ted called. "Get her to bend all the way over, with her hands on the ground," Harry called, waving up to the she-giant, who had kneeled, but become distracted by Hagrid's garden. She pulled up a handful of pumpkins, roots, and all, and began stuffing them into her mouth. That's right, Hagrid called soothingly. "Just lean over here a bit. There we go." No. There was a sharp wooden crunch as Prechka leaned on Hagrid's wagon, crushing it to kindling. Hagrid patted the gigantic elbow, shaking his head. "Oil, at least, yeah, can climb up now, Harry. Just use the wall there as a step. There you go." Prechka was being coaxed upright again, Harry and Ted perched on her shoulders, when Grop entered the woods lining the west side of the lake, and all view of the Hogwarts grounds vanished behind dense, stunted trees. Grop was surprisingly gentle, turning sideways and ducking to avoid branches that might knock his cargo off his back. James could feel the weight of Grop's footsteps pressing into the ground far below, but experienced none of the shudder and thump he had expected to feel riding on a giant's back. Hardcastle directed Grop quietly, being seated almost right next to the giant's ear. He led them in an orderly zigzag, approaching the lake, and then turning back into the thick of the wood again, slowly advancing around the perimeter. Their progress was slow, and the motion of Grop's walking began to rock James into sleepiness. He shook himself awake, studying the ground below for any of the signs his dad had described. In an attempt to keep himself awake, he explained to Hardcastle and Zane how he had seen the unidentified man on the Quidditch pitch. He told them about the camera, and described the other 2 times he'd seen the man on the grounds. "You've seen this person 3 times, then?" Hardcastle asked, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Yeah," James nodded. "But apart from your dad tonight, no one else has seen him at all?" James felt rankled by that, but answered directly. "No. Nobody." They were silent again for a while. James guessed that they had traveled approximately a third of the way around the perimeter. He saw glimpses of the castle looming over the lake whenever they neared its edge. The woods seemed annoyingly untouched and normal. Crickets buzzed and creaked, filling the night air with their strange chorus. Everywhere James looked, fireflies stitched the shadows, going about their nocturnal business. There was no sign that anyone had ever been through this wood, much less anyone recently. "Stop, Grop," Hardcastle said suddenly, his voice tense. Grop stopped obediently and stood still. His massive head turned slightly as he looked around. James peered around. Grop's enormous, dirty ear, trying to see what Hardcastle was looking at or listening for. Half a minute crept by. James knew not to speak. Then, in the near distance, there was a harsh scurrying sound. Something scrambled, unseen, through the fallen leaves and stopped again. A branch creaked, as if it were being stepped on. James' heart was suddenly pounding. Still, neither Grop nor Hardcastle moved. James saw Hardcastle turn his head slightly, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It came again, nearer this time, but still unseen. It was ahead of them, behind a low rise on the wood side of their path. James couldn't help thinking that there was something distinctly inhuman about the scurrying sound. It was, somehow, too busy. The hair at the base of his neck prickled. Hardcastle tapped the back of Grop's head lightly and pointed toward the ground, reaching so Grop could see his hand. James felt the giant lower, and was surprised again at the slow grace of the motion. The leaves underfoot crackled only slightly as Grop put his hands on the ground. Hardcastle slid silently off Grop's back. His eyes were locked on the low rise ahead. "Stay with." He was interrupted by the noise of scrambling movement. It was much closer this time, and now James saw the motion of it. Dead leaves scattered into the air as a large, shadowy form scuttled over the rise, moving with horrible speed. It darted in and out of the trunks of the trees, crashing through bushes. It seemed to have far too many legs, and there was a strange, bluish glow emanating from its front. It flickered wildly as the thing moved. Hardcastle leaped in front of Grop as the thing approached. He flipped his wand with the practiced economy of a trained orar, sending red stunning spells into the thrashing brush and leaves. The creature changed course, skirting around them and into a gully. The flickering blue glow marked its progress as it skittered over dead logs, retreating deeper into the wood. "Stay with Grop, you two," Hardcastle growled, setting off after the creature at a run. "Grop, if anything other than me comes back, crush it." He moved with amazing agility for his size. Within 15 seconds, neither he nor the retreating creature could be seen or heard. The two boys jumped off Grop's shoulders to peer down into the gully. "What was that?" Zane asked, breathlessly. James shook his head. "I'm not even sure I want to know. It definitely wasn't the guy we're looking for." "I'm glad of that," Zane said with conviction. They watched the gully that Hardcastle and the creature had vanished into. The incessant chorus of crickets and the flashing of the fireflies filled the woods again, seeming to deny that anything unusual was happening. There was no noise or movement from the gully. "How far will he chase that thing?" Zane finally asked. James shrugged. "Until he catches it, I guess." "Or it catches him," Zane added, shuddering. "You know, I felt a lot better about this when we were up on the big guy's shoulders." "Good idea," James agreed, turning. "Hey, Grop, how about..." He stopped. Grop was gone. Zane and James glanced around for several seconds, both too stunned and spooked to say anything. "There," Zane said suddenly, stabbing a finger in the direction of the lake. James looked. Grop was just disappearing around a gigantic, moss-bearded boulder, lumbering slowly. "Come on. Don't let him get out of sight." Both boys scampered after the giant, crawling over huge fallen trees and slipping on leaf-covered rocks. They rounded the house-sized boulder they had seen Grop pass. Grop was even further away, ducking under a leaning, dead tree. "Where's he going?" Zane cried exasperatedly. "Grop," James called, hesitant to yell too loudly for fear of attracting any more of the horrible, scuttling creatures. The night had gone dim. Heavy, marching clouds obscured the moon, reducing the woods to a muddle of gray shadows. "Grop, come back." "What are you doing?" For several minutes, Zane and James followed Grop's trail, struggling through creek beds and over tree trunks that the giant traversed in one step. Finally, they caught up to him near the edge of the lake, where a group of small, wooded islands obscured the view across the water. The air smelled damp and mossy and was dense with buzzing insects. Grop stood under a gnarled tree, methodically plucking walnuts off the branches and popping them into his mouth, shell and all. He crunched them audibly as the boys approached, panting. "Grop!" Zane cried, struggling to catch his breath. "What are you doing?" Grop glanced down at the sound of Zane's voice, his expression quizzical. "Grop hungry," he answered. "Grop smell food. Grop eat and wait. Little man comes back. Grop, we're lost now. Titus won't even know where we are," James said, trying to control his anger. Grop stared at him, still crunching walnuts, his expression one of mild bewilderment. "Never mind," Zane said. "Let him chomp some nuts, then we'll get him to carry us back the way we came." He plopped onto a nearby rock and examined the scrapes and bruises he'd gotten during the chase. James grimaced in annoyance. He knew there was no point in arguing with the giant. "All right," he said tersely. "Grop, just carry us back when you're done." "Got it." Grop grunted agreement, pulling one of the larger tree branches down to him so that it creaked ominously. James wandered disconsolately toward the water's edge, pushing reeds and bushes aside. The lake looked more like a creek here, with only a narrow stretch of mossy water between the shore and one of the marshy islands. The island was wild, covered with densely packed bushes and trees. It had the look of a place that was underwater at least part of the year. 20 feet away, a group of trees had fallen away from the island. James assumed they'd been pried loose from their watery roots by a recent storm. The scene was remarkably ugly and foreboding in the shadowy night. James had just decided to turn back, worried that Hardcastle would be looking for them when the moon came out. As the silvery light spread across the woods, James stalked, a slow, gravid chill shaking him from head to toe. The crickets had fallen suddenly and completely silent. James felt rooted to the spot, frozen except for his eyes, which roamed the surrounding woods. The silence of the crickets wasn't the only change. The perpetual, myriad flashes of the fireflies had also ceased. The wood had gone completely and suddenly still in the wash of moonlight. "James?" Zane's voice came, tentative in the sudden, oppressive silence. "Is this, normal?" He joined James at the edge of the lake. "And what's the deal with that place?" James glanced at Zane. "What place?" He followed Zane's eyes, and then gasped. The island that lay just off the shore had changed. James could tell that no individual part of it was different, exactly. It was just that, what had appeared as totally random trees and bushes a minute before, now, in the silvery moonlight, looked much more like a hidden, ancient structure. There was the unmistakable suggestion of pillars and gates, buttresses, and gargoyles, all crafted out of the island's natural growth as if it were a sort of incredibly complex optical illusion. "I do not like the look of that joint," Zane said emphatically, his voice low. James looked further. The group of trees that had fallen across the water, connecting the island to the shore, had changed as well. James could see that there was order to them. Two of them had fallen together so that they formed what was obviously a bridge. The bridge was even stylized, fashioned to resemble a gigantic dragon's head. A brown rock jutting from the upturned roots served as the eye. Two more trees, only half collapsed, formed the open upper jaw, jutting out over the bridge as if to snap down on anyone that attempted to cross. James walked carefully toward the bridge. "Hey, you're not going in there, are you?" Zane called. "That doesn't look so healthy to me." "Come on," James said, not looking back. "You said you wanted adventure and really wild stuff." "Well, actually I think I just want those things in little bitty doses. I had enough with that crazy monster we saw already, if you don't mind." James skirted an outcropping of bushes and spindly trees and found himself standing at the mouth of the bridge. Closer to, it was even more perfect. There were handrails formed by fallen birches, smooth and easy to grip, and the two trees that formed the floor of the bridge were so close together, with vines and leaves packed between them, that they made an easy walking surface. "Fine, stay here," James said, not really blaming Zane for his reluctance. The mystery of it was strangely attractive to James, though. He stepped onto the bridge. "Ah, sheesh," Zane moaned, following. On the island side of the bridge, a complicated growth of vines and small trees had formed into a set of tall, ornate gates. Beyond them was impenetrable shadow. As James crept closer, he could see that the vines formed a recognizable pattern across the gates. "I think it spells something," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Look. It's a poem, or rune, or something." As soon as he was able to make out the first word, the rest sprang into view, as if he just had to train his eye to see it. He stopped and read aloud. "When by the light of Solva bright I found the grotto keep, before the night of time required did wake his languid sleep. Upon return the fretted dawn, with not a relic lossing, by dawn a life, and new eon, the hall of elders crossing." Something about the poem made James shudder. "What's it mean?" Zane asked when he'd read it over twice. James shrugged. "Solva is an old word for moon. I know that. I think the first part just means you can only find this place when the moon shines on it. That's got to be true, because when I first saw it in the dark, it just looked like some ugly old island. So this must be the grotto keep, whatever that is." Zane leaned in. "What about this part? Upon return the fretted dawn. Sounds like we're supposed to come back when the sun comes back up, eh?" "Sounds pretty good to me." Ignoring Zane, James wrapped his hands around the gates and gave them a hard yank. They rattled woodenly, but didn't budge. The action seemed to trigger a response from the island. A sudden, creeping sound came from beneath the boy's feet. James glanced down, and then jumped backwards as tendrils of thorny vines grew up from underneath the bridge. The vines twined through the gate, weaving up it with a noise like a newspaper in a fire. The thorns were an ugly purple color, as if they might contain some sort of venom. They grew longer as James watched. After a minute, the gates were completely entwined with them, obscuring the words of the poem. The noise of their growth died away. "Well, that settles that, then," Zane said in a strangely high voice. He was standing behind James, backing away slowly. "I think this place wants to be left alone, don't you?" "I want to try one more thing," James said, pulling his wand out from beneath his cloak. Without really thinking about it, he aimed his wand at the gate. Alhamra. There was a streak of golden light, and this time, the result was immediate and powerful. The gates repelled the spell, obliterating it in a burst of sparks, and the entire island seemed to shiver, to tense menacingly. There was a sound like 1,000 people suddenly breathing in, and then a voice, an entirely inhuman, swarming sort of voice, spoke. "Get the hands." James stumbled backwards at the vehemence of the response, tumbling into Zane and knocking them both to the floor of the bridge. The bridge shuddered beneath them, and then James saw that the gates were swaying, leaning over them. The trees overhead, the ones that were fashioned to appear as the upper jaw of the Dragon's Head Bridge, were creaking down, looming, their broken branches looking more and more like teeth. "Get the hands," the island said again. The voice sounded like it was comprised of millions of tiny voices, whispering and raspy, speaking in unison. The floor of the bridge buckled, tearing loose of the shore. The upper jaws crackled and began to collapse, ready to devour the two boys. They scrambled backwards, tumbling wildly over each other, and fell onto the weedy shore just as the bridge ripped loose. The gigantic jaws snapped and gnashed ferociously. Broken branches and bits of bark exploded from the writhing shape, peppering James and Zane as they scuttled away, their hands slipping on dead leaves and pine needles. The ground rumbled under them. Roots began to burrow up from the dirt, tearing the earth apart. James felt the shore disintegrate beneath him. His foot slipped into a sudden hole and he yanked it out, narrowly avoiding a dirty, carrot-like root that writhed up out of it. He struggled for purchase on the collapsing shore, but it sank beneath him, dragging him back toward the water's edge. The surface of the lake roiled, rushing into the forming sinkhole. The boys' feet splashed into the muck, and it sucked at them, pulling them in. Zane grasped at the shore as he was pulled slowly into the frothing water. James groped for purchase, but nothing seemed solid. Even the tree roots revealed by the crumbling earth grew loose and slippery under his hands, covered in a horrible slime that came off in coats. Then, suddenly, there was Grop. He dropped to his knees, gripping a nearby tree trunk with one hand and reaching for Zane, who was nearer, with the other. He plucked the boy from the murk and plopped him onto his shoulder. Zane grasped for a handhold on Grop's shirt as the giant lunged down to retrieve James, who was nearly submerged in the thrashing waters. A horrible, hairy root snaked across the water and curled around James' ankle, yanking him back. He hung there, caught between Grop's grip and that of the horrid root, and James was sure he'd be torn in half by the force of it. The root slipped on his pant leg and yanked his shoe off. James saw it twine hungrily around the shoe and pull it under the surface. Grop tried to stand, but roots were ripping up from the ground all around him. Huge, crackling wood tentacles twined his legs. Green vines grew with lightning speed up the thicker tentacles, sewing themselves into the fabric of his pants with tiny, thread-like roots. Grop roared and yanked, ripping his pants and tearing the roots further out of the ground, but their combined force was too strong. They pulled him back to a kneeling position, and then lunged up, circling his waist, climbing his back and shoulders. The vines battened onto James and Zane, threatening to pull them off. Grot roared again as one of the green vines twisted around his neck, forcing him lower, pulling him down into the sinkhole. Just as James began to slip off Grop's shoulder, pulled back toward the ground by a dozen muscling vines, sudden, shocking light filled the air. It was a vibrant golden green, and it was accompanied by a low humming sound. The vines and roots recoiled from the light. They loosened, repulsed by it, but were dreadfully reluctant to abandon their prey. Waves of the light washed over them, and each wave loosened the tangling mass until the smaller vines fell away as dead and the larger roots retreated, sucking back down into the earth with a nasty, gurgling noise. Grop, James, and Zane half crawled up the bank until they found firm ground. There they collapsed, panting and heaving, amid the dead leaves and broken branches. When James rolled over and pulled himself to a kneeling position, there was a figure standing nearby, glowing faintly with the same golden-green light that had repulsed the vines. James could see through the figure, although what he saw through it was both brightened and refracted, the way things might look if seen through a raindrop. The figure looked like a woman, very tall and very thin, in a dark green gown that fell straight from her hips and, apparently, right through the ground. Her whitish-green hair spread and flowed around her head like a corona. She was beautiful, but her face was grave. James Potter, Zane Walker, Grot, son of the earth, you are in danger here. You must leave this wood. No human is safe under this canopy now. James struggled to his feet. Who are you? What was that? I am a dryad, a spirit of the wood. I have managed to silence the voice of the island, but I won't be able to hold it back for long. It grows more restless with each day. A spirit of the wood? Zane asked as Grot helped him rather roughly to his feet. The woods have a ghost? I am a dryad, a tree sprite, a spirit of a single tree. All the trees in the wood have spirits, but they have been asleep for ages and ages, seeped down into the earth, almost diminished. Until now, the naiads and dryads have been awakened, though we know not why. Those few humans that once communed with the trees are gone and forgotten. Our time is past. Yet we are summoned. Who summoned you? James asked. We have not been able to know that, despite our greatest efforts. There is disharmony among us. Many trees remember only the saw of man, not his replanting. They are old and angry, wishing only to do harm to the world of men. They have gone over. You have experienced their wrath, though not as they would have it. What do you mean, they've gone over? Zane asked, taking half a step closer, squinting at the dryad's beauty. Is it that place? The island? The Hall of Elders Crossing? Man's time is short on the earth, but we trees watch the years march past like days. The stars are motionless to you, but we watch and study the heavens as a dance, the dryad said, her voice becoming soft, almost dreamy. Since our awakening, the dance of the stars has become dire, showing 1,000 dark destinies for the world of men, all swinging on the balance of the coming days. Only one possible destiny bears good. The rest are heavy with bloodshed and loss. Great sorrow. Dark times, full of war and greed, powerful tyrants, famines of terror. Much will be determined within the closing of this cycle. We tree folk can only watch, for now, but those of us who remain faithful to the memory of harmony between our world and the world of men, when the time comes, we will help as we can. James was almost hypnotized by the dryad's voice, but he felt a rising sense of helplessness and frustration at her words. But you said there is one chance we can avoid this war. What can we do? How can we make the one good destiny happen? The dryad's face softened. Her large, liquid eyes smiled sadly. There is no way to predict the path of a single action. It could be that you are already doing that which will bring about peace. It could also be that the very things you do for good are the things that will result in war. You must do what you know to do, but only with an unclouded mind. Zane risked a derisive laugh. Helpful stuff, there, Sensei. There are greater dangers in the fabric of destinies than you yet know, James Potter, the Dryad said, slipping closer to James so that her light played across his face. The enemy of your father, and of all who know love, is dead. But his blood beats within a different heart. The blood of your greatest enemy lives still. James felt his knees grow watery. He wobbled, and then threw his hand out, pressing it against a nearby tree for support. Voldemort, he whispered. The Dryad nodded, apparently unwilling to say the name. His preferred plan was thwarted forever by your father. But he was infinitely crafty. He prepared a second plan. A successor, a bloodline. The heart of that bloodline beats today, at this moment, not 1 mile hence. James' lips were trembling. Who? He asked in a barely audible voice. Who is it? But the Dryad was already shaking her head sadly. We are prevented from knowing. Not from without, but from within. Those trees that have gone over work against us, fog our vision, keep many of us asleep. We can only know of that heartbeat, that it is there, but no more. You must beware, James Potter. Your father's battle is over. Yours begins. The Dryad was fading. Her eyes slipped shut, and even as she drifted into nothingness, she already seemed to be asleep. There was a creaking groan, then a splash from the island. Well, Zane said with manic cheerfulness, what say we jump back onto our giant buddy's shoulders and make this place a memory before it does the same to us? The three of them met Titus Hardcastle before they were halfway back to their starting point. His face was like a thunderstorm, but all he said was, is everyone safe? Safe enough, Zane called down from Grop's shoulders. But let me tell you, we've had one weird time of it. Grot bent down to allow Hardcastle to climb onto his back. It's going around, then, isn't it? Hardcastle grunted. Zane held a hand out, intending to help Hardcastle climb up and almost getting yanked from his seat instead. So what was that thing you were chasing, anyway? He said, puffing. Spider. One of old Aragog's kin, no doubt. They've grown dumb in the last decade or two, but that one had gone and found himself a toil. Hardcastle held something up, and James saw that it was the little handheld video camera that the intruder had been using on the Quidditch pitch. It was still working when I caught up to the brute, the little screen all lit up. Got broken when I, dispatched the beast. At least, it had had a good last meal. James shuddered involuntarily as Grot began to make his way back through the woods. You really think it? At the guy? Hardcastle set his jaw. Circle of life, James. Strictly speaking, though, spiders don't eat people. They just suck their juices out. Ugly way to go, but at least he's not a problem anymore. James didn't say so, but he had a feeling that the real problems were just beginning. Wednesday morning, James felt sluggish and prickly as he entered the Great Hall for breakfast. It was a thoroughly glum morning, with a low, bruised sky filling the top portion of the hall and a fine mist speckling the windows. Ralph and Zane were seated at the Slytherin table, Zane blowing on his traditional morning coffee and Ralph attacking an orange with a butter knife, sawing through it, peel and all. They didn't appear to be talking much. Zane wasn't typically a morning person, and he had been out just as late as James had been. Neither Zane nor Ralph looked up, and James was glad. He was still angry and disgusted with Ralph. Under that, though, he was sad and hurt about the boy's betrayal. He tried not to feel resentment toward Zane for sitting with Ralph, but he was too tired to make much of an effort, and the mood of the morning wasn't helping. James made his way to the Gryffindor table, glancing up at the dais as he went. Neither his dad nor Titus Hardcastle were anywhere to be seen. James figured that, despite the lateness of the previous night, they had still risen and breakfasted shortly after dawn and were already about their morning's business. The thought that his dad's and Titus' day was already well underway, probably full of exciting meetings and secret intrigues, while he was just now having breakfast on his way to a day of gloomy classes and homework, filled him with melancholy. He found a seat surrounded by happily babbling Gryffindors, plopped into it, and began to eat methodically, joylessly. The night before, James had been up with Titus Hardcastle, his dad, and Headmistress McGonagall for almost 2 hours after their return from the perimeter of the lake. Titus had sent up a wand signal as soon as they'd reached the castle, summoning Harry, Ted, Prechka, and Hagrid back from their forays. When they'd all assembled again by Hagrid's cottage, the headmistress dismissed Grop and Prechka, thanking them both formally, and offering them a barrel of butterbeer for their efforts. After that, the group convened in Hagrid's cottage, congregated around the huge, rough table, drinking Hagrid's tea, which was suspiciously cloudy and brown, and tasted vaguely medicinal, and avoiding some rather stale biscuits. Hardcastle had spoken first. He explained to everyone present how he had first heard the spider, and then pursued it, leaving James and Zane in the protection of Grop. Harry had shifted in his seat, but refrained from comment. After all, he had been the one to request that James go along on the expedition, and had consented, albeit reluctantly, to Zane's accompaniment. The headmistress had pointed a rather long and penetrating glare at Harry when she'd seen Zane enter the cottage. Now McGonagall turned to Hardcastle, asking how he'd managed to kill the spider. Hardcastle's beady eyes glinted a little as he said, "Best way to kill a spider that won't fit under your boot is to get its legs off. First one's the hardest. After that, it gets easier and easier." Hagrid wiped a hand over his face. Poor ol' Aragog. If he'd lived to see his young turn wild, it'd have killed him. Poor fellow was just doing what spiders do. You can hardly blame him. The spider had the intruder's camera, Harry said, glancing down at the broken object on the table. The lens was shattered and the little screen on the back was cracked. So we know the man escaped via the lake woods. Nasty way to go, whoever he may have been, McGonagall said. Harry's expression didn't change. We don't know for certain that the spider caught the man. Seems unlikely the thing asked to borrow his camera so it could make home movies of its kids, doesn't it? Hardcastle rumbled, spiders aren't the polite type. They're the hungry type. Harry nodded thoughtfully. You're probably right, Titus. Still, there's always the chance the intruder dropped the camera and the spider simply found it. It wouldn't hurt to increase security for a while, Minerva. We don't yet know how this person got in or who he was. Until we learn those things, we have to assume there is an ongoing risk of breach. I'm particularly interested in knowing how this camera managed to operate within the grounds, the headmistress sniffed, staring hard at the device on the table. It is well known that Muggle equipment of this sort doesn't work inside the school's magical environment. That is indeed well known, Madam Headmistress, Hardcastle rumbled, but very little understood. The Muggles are endlessly inventive with their tools. What once was true may not be so anymore. And we all know that the protective spells directed around the grounds since the battle are not quite as perfect as those maintained by old Dumbledore, God rest his soul. James thought of Ralph's game deck, but decided not to mention it. The broken video camera was all the proof they needed that at least some modern Muggle devices worked on the school grounds. Finally, attention turned to James and Zane. James explained how Grop had wandered away in search of food, and how the two boys had chased him, finding him by the lake and the marshy island. Zane chimed in then, describing the mysterious island and the bridge. He carefully glossed over the part where James had tried to open the gates using magic, and James was glad. It had seemed foolish the very moment he'd done it, and he regretted it. Still, at the time, it had felt so natural. They took turns telling of the enchanted dragon's head bridge that attempted to eat them, then the attacking vines that had almost pulled them all into the sinkhole. Finally, James explained the tale of the tree sprite. Naiads and dryads? Hagrid exclaimed incredulously. James and Zane stopped, blinking at him. Hagrid went on, "Well, they're not for real, are they? They're just stories and myth. Aren't they?" He addressed the last question to the adults present. "The Lake Woods are just an extension of the Forbidden Forest," Harry said. "If there is a place where things like the Naiads and Dryads can exist, it'd be there. Still, if it's true, they haven't been seen for hundreds of years. Of course, we'd think of them as myth." "What do you mean, if it's true?" James asked, a little louder than he'd intended to. "We saw her. She spoke to us." "Your father is being an orator, James," McGonagall said placatingly. "All possibilities must be considered. You were all under a great deal of stress. It isn't that we don't believe you. We must simply determine the most likely explanation for what you saw." "Seems like the most likely explanation to me is that she was what she said she was," James muttered under his breath. James purposely hadn't told his dad or any of the other adults the last thing the sprite had said, the part about the successor, the blood of the enemy beating in another heart. Part of his reluctance was in his remembrance of his dad's stories of how the wizarding world had treated him, Harry Potter, when he'd returned from the Triwizard Tournament maze with the tale of Voldemort's return, how he had been doubted and discredited. Another part of it was that his dad wasn't even prepared to believe the part about the Dryad. If he doubted that, how could he accept that the Dryad had predicted a new kind of Voldemort's return, through an heir, a bloodline? But the thing that had finally determined James not to tell was his memory of the very last words the Dryad had spoken: "Your father's battle is over. Yours begins." The conversation had droned on long after all the details had been described and discussed, long after James had grown bored with it. He wanted to get back so that he could sleep, but more than that, he wanted time to think about what the Dryad had said. He wanted to work out what the island was for, what the poem on the gate meant. He worked to remember it, itching to write it down while it was still fresh in his mind. He was sure, somehow, that it all fit in with the story of Ostermaddox and the secret plot of the Slytherins to bring back Merlin and start a final war with the Muggle world. He wasn't even asking himself anymore if it was true. It had to be true, and it was up to him to prevent it. Finally, the adults finished talking. They had determined that the mysterious island, while obviously dangerous, was just one of the many mysterious and inexplicable dangers that made the Forbidden Forest forbidden. The primary concern was still discovering how the intruder had gotten in, and making sure no one else was able to do it again. With that resolution, the meeting broke up. Headmistress McGonagall had accompanied James, Zane, and Ted back to the castle, instructing them to do their best to keep the discussions of the night a secret. "Especially you, Mr. Lupin," she said sternly. "The last thing we need is you and your band of hooligans running off into the woods in the middle of the night attempting to duplicate Mr. Potter's and Mr. Walker's experiences." Fortunately, Ted knew enough not to try to deny the possibility of such a thing. He merely nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am." James only saw his dad once more during his visit, and that was after classes that evening, just as Harry, Titus, and the ministry officials were preparing to leave. Neville had returned to Hogwarts that afternoon, and he chaperoned James to the headmistress' office to say goodbye to Harry and the rest. The group planned to travel via the Fleur network, as they had arrived, and had decided upon the headmistress' fireplace for their departure, since it was the most secure. If it struck Neville odd that the office now belonged to his former teacher, who he'd known as Professor McGonagall, instead of to Albus Dumbledore, he didn't let on. But he did pause for a moment next to the portrait of the former headmaster. "Off again, is he?" he asked Harry. "I think he generally just sleeps here. Dumbledore's got portraits all over the place," Harry sighed. "Not to mention all his old chocolate franc cards. He still shows up in them, sometimes, just for fun. I keep mine in my wallet, just in case. He pulled his wallet out and slipped a dog-eared card out of it. The portrait space was empty. Harry grinned at Neville as he put it back. Neville moved to the group congregated around the fireplace. Harry squatted down next to James. I wanted to thank you, James. James hid the look of pride that surfaced on his face. I was just doing what you asked us to do. I don't just mean coming along with us and helping us find out what happened, Harry said, putting a hand on James' shoulder. I mean for spying the intruder on the field and pointing him out to me. And for being alert enough to see him the other times. You've got a sharp eye and an alert mind, my boy. I shouldn't be surprised, and I'm not. James grinned. Thanks, Dad. Don't forget what we talked about the other night, though. Remember? James remembered. I won't be saving the world single-handedly. I'll have at least Zane's help, he thought, but didn't say, and maybe Ted's, too, now that Ralph's abandoned me. Harry hugged his son, and James hugged him back. They grinned at each other, Harry with his hands on James' shoulders, and then he stood, leading James over to the fireplace. Tell Mum I'm doing good and eating my vegetables, James instructed his dad. And are you? Harry asked, raising one eyebrow. Well, yes and no, James said, a bit uncomfortable as everyone looked at him. Make it true and I'll tell her, Harry said, removing his glasses and tucking them into his robe. Moments later, the room was empty but for James, Headmistress McGonagall, and Neville. Professor Longbottom, the headmistress said, I suspect it'd be best for me to inform you of all that has happened these past 20 hours. You mean, regarding the campus intruder, madam? Neville asked. The headmistress looked markedly taken aback. I see. Perhaps I might simply be repeating myself, then. Do tell me what you've already heard, Professor. Merely that, madam. Word amongst the students is that a man was seen or captured on the Quidditch pitch yesterday. The common theory is that he was a representative of the gambling community, either reporting on or influencing the match. Pure rubbish, of course, but I assume it's better to let tongues wag and inflate the tale to something ridiculous than to deny anything. Mr. Potter would no doubt agree with you, the headmistress said pointedly. Although, since I will be requiring your services in increasing the security of the grounds, I should explain to you precisely what did occur. James, you are free to wait a moment, aren't you? I shall not detain the professor for long, and he will accompany you down to the corridor. Without waiting for a reply, she turned back to Neville, launching into a detailed account of the previous night. James knew the whole story, of course, but still felt he was meant to wait near the door, as far from earshot as possible. It was uncomfortable and vaguely annoying. He felt rather proprietary about the intruder, having been the first to see him, and having been the one to point him out on the Quidditch pitch. It was just like adults to deny something a kid said, then, when it proved true, to completely take over and dismiss the kid. He realized that this was another part of why he hadn't yet told any adults about his suspicions concerning the Slytherin Merlin plot. He felt even stronger now about keeping that his secret, at least until he could prove something substantial. James crossed his arms and hovered near the door, turning to look back at Neville, who was seated in front of the headmistress' desk, and McGonagall, who was pacing slightly behind it as she spoke. What are you up to, Potter? A low voice drawled behind James, making him jump. He spun around, wildly, eyes wide. The voice cut him off before he could respond. Don't ask who I am, and don't waste my time with a load of pointless lies. You know exactly who I am. And I know, even more than your own father, that you are up to something. It was, of course, the portrait of Severus Snape. The dark eyes probed James coldly, the mouth turned down into a knowing sneer. James began, and then stopped, feeling very strongly that if he lied, the portrait would know. I'm not going to tell. A more honest answer than any ever provided by your father, at least, Snape drawled, keeping his voice low enough not to attract the attention of McGonagall or Neville. It's a pity I'm not still alive to be headmaster, or I'd find ways of getting the tale from you, one way or another. Well, James whispered, feeling a little braver now that shock had worn off. I guess it's a good thing you weren't headmaster anymore, then. He thought it might be a bit too much to say it's a good thing you're dead. James' dad had a load of respect for Severus Snape. He'd even made Severus Albus' middle name. Don't try the smart tactic with me, Potter, the portrait said, but more tiredly than angrily. You, unlike your father, know well enough now that I was as devoted to Albus Dumbledore and the downfall of Voldemort as was he. Your father believed it was up to him to win battles entirely on his own. He was foolish and destructive. Don't think I didn't see that very same look in your eye not 5 minutes ago. James couldn't think what to say. He just met the portrait's dark gaze and frowned stubbornly. Snape sighed theatrically. Have it your way, then. Like Potter, like son. Never learning the lessons of the past. But know this, I will be watching you, as I did your father. If your unnamed suspicions are, against all probability, accurate, be assured that I will be working toward the same end as you. Try, Potter, not to make the same mistakes as your father. Try not to leave others to pay the consequences for your arrogance. That last stung James to the core. He assumed Snape would leave his portrait frame after a salvo like that, confident of having had the last word, but he didn't. He stayed, that same penetrating stare on his face, reading James like a book. Still, there wasn't anything specifically malicious in that gaze, despite the pointed words. Yeah, James finally found the voice to say. Well, I'll keep that in mind. It was a lame response, and he knew it. He was only 11, after all. James? Neville said behind him. James turned and looked up at the professor. Sounds like you had an exciting night last night. I'm curious about the vines that attacked you. Maybe you could tell me more about them sometime, yes? Sure, James said, his lips feeling numb. When he turned back toward the door, following Neville out, the portrait of Snape was still occupied. The eyes followed him darkly as he left the room. 9. The debate, betrayal. As James became more familiar with the routine of school, time seemed to slip past almost without his noticing. Zane continued to excel at Quidditch, and James continued to feel an uncomfortable mix of emotions about Zane's success. He still felt the stab of jealousy when he heard the crowd cheer for one of Zane's well-hit bludgers, but he couldn't help smiling at how much the boy loved the sport, how he delighted in each match, in the teamwork and camaraderie. Also, James was growing increasingly confident of his own broom skills. He practiced with Zane on the Quidditch pitch many evenings, asking Zane for tips on technique. Zane, for his part, was always enthusiastic and supportive, telling James that he'd definitely make the Gryffindor team next year. Then I'll have to stop practicing with you and giving you pointers, you know, Zane said, flying next to James and calling over the roar of the air. It'd be like consorting with the enemy. As usual, James couldn't tell if Zane was joking or not. James enjoyed becoming more confident on the broom, but he was surprised to discover that he loved football. Tina Curry had divided all of her classes into teams and arranged a casual game schedule for them to play against one another. Many students had grasped the essential concepts of the game and, being competitive at heart, had worked to make the class time matches interesting. Occasionally, a student would forget the non-magical nature of the sport and would be seen frantically searching their pockets for their wands or simply pointing at the ball and yelling something like "Catch yo football," resulting in a general breakdown of the match while everyone laughed. Once, a Hufflepuff girl had simply grabbed the ball in both hands, forgetting the basic rules of the game, and charged down the field as if she were playing rugby. James discovered, rather reluctantly, that Professor Curry's assessment of his skills had been fairly accurate. He was a natural. He could control the ball easily with the tips of his trainers as he zigged and zagged down the field. His ball handling was regarded as among the best of any of the new players, and his scoring rate was second only to fifth-year Sabrina Hildegard, who, like Zane, was Muggle-born and unlike Zane, had played on Muggle leads when she was younger. James and Ralph, however, barely talked. James' initial anger and resentment had simmered down to a stubborn aloofness. Some small part of him knew that he should forgive Ralph, and even apologize for yelling at him that day in the grate hall. He knew that if he'd kept his cool, Ralph probably would have seen the error of siding with his Slytherin housemates. Instead, Ralph seemed to feel it was his duty to support the Slytherins and the progressive element as earnestly as he could. If it wasn't for the fact that even Ralph's enthusiastic support was rather weak-willed and doleful, James would have found it easier to stay angry at him. Ralph wore the blue badges, and he attended the debate meetings in the library, but he did so with such a dogged attitude of obligation that it seemed to do more harm than good. If any of the Slytherins actually spoke to him, he'd jerk upright and respond with manic eagerness, then deflate as soon as they turned their attention elsewhere. It hurt James a little to watch it, but not enough to make him change his attitude toward Ralph. In his room at night, or in a corner of the library, James would study the poem he and Zane had seen on the gate to the grotto keep. With Zane's help, he had written it down from memory and was confident it was accurate. Still, he couldn't seem to make much of it. All he knew for sure was that the first two lines referred to the fact that the grotto keep could only be found by moonlight. The rest was a puzzle. He kept fetching up on the line that read, "Did wake his languid sleep," wondering if that could refer to Merlin. But Merlin wasn't asleep, was he? "Makes it sound like he's Rip Van Winkle," Zane whispered one day in the library. Snoozing away a few hundred years out under a tree somewhere. Zane had had to explain the fairy tale of Rip Van Winkle, and James considered it. He knew from hearing his dad's conversations with other Aurors that much of Muggle mythology came from long, distant encounters with witches and wizards. Stories of wizarding lore made their way into Muggle fairy tales, became stylized or altered, and grew into legends and myth. Perhaps, James mused, this story of the Long Sleeper, who awoke hundreds of years later, was a Muggle echo of the story of Merlin. Still, it didn't get James or Zane any closer to figuring out how Merlin could possibly return after so many centuries, nor did it offer any clues as to who might be involved in such a conspiracy. At night, as he was drifting to sleep, James often found his thoughts returning, strangely enough, to his conversation with the portrait of Severus Snape. Snape had said he'd be watching James, but James couldn't imagine how that could be. There was only one portrait of Snape on the Hogwarts grounds, as far as James knew, and it was up in the headmistress' office. How could Snape possibly be watching James? Snape had been a powerful wizard, and a potions genius, according to Dad and Mum, but how would either of those things allow his portrait to see around the castle? Still, James didn't doubt Snape. If Snape said he was watching him, James felt confident that, somehow or other, it was true. It was only after 2 weeks of mulling over the conversation he'd had with Snape that James realized what struck him most about it. To Snape, unlike James and the rest of the wizarding world, it was a foregone conclusion that James was just like his father. Like Potter, like son, he'd said, sneering. Ironically, though, to Snape, if no one else, this was not precisely a good thing. As the leaves in the Forbidden Forest began to settle into the browns and yellows of autumn, the blue progressive element buttons were augmented by the posters and banners for the first all-school debate. As Ralph had predicted, the theme was re-evaluating the assumptions of the past, truth or conspiracy. As if the words themselves weren't enough, the right side of each banner and poster bore a drawing of a lightning bolt that was enchanted to shift into the shape of a question mark every few seconds. Zane, who, according to Petra, was quite good at debate, told James that the school debate committee had argued for quite some time about the topic of the first event. Tabitha Corsical was not on the debate committee, but her crony, Philia GRETEL, was the committee chair. So in the end, Zane had reported to James, the debate team turned out to be a great example of democracy in action. They argued all night, then she chose. He shrugged wearily. The sight of the signs and banners, and especially, that very unambiguous lightning bolt, made James' blood boil. Seeing Ralph on a ladder finishing hanging one of the banners just outside the door to technomancy class was more than he could take. "I'm surprised you can reach like that, Ralph," James said, anger pushing the words out. "What with Tabitha Corsica's hand so far up your backside?" Zane, who'd been walking next to James, sighed and ducked into the classroom. Ralph hadn't noticed James until he spoke. He glanced down, his expression surprised and wounded. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "It means, I'd think by now, you'd have gotten sick of being her little first-year puppet." James already regretted saying anything. The guileless misery on Ralph's face shamed him. Ralph had the mantra down well, though. "Your people are the puppet masters, preying on the fears of the weak-minded to maintain the demagoguery of prejudice and unfairness," he said, but without much conviction. James rolled his eyes and walked into the classroom. Professor Jackson was absent from his usual spot behind the teacher's desk. James sat next to Zane in the front row. As he sat down, he made a point of joking and laughing with a few other Gryffindors nearby, knowing Ralph was watching through the doorway. The mean pleasure it gave him was hollow and raw, but it was pleasure nonetheless. Finally, the room hushed. James looked up and saw Professor Jackson entering, carrying something under his arm. The object was large, flat, and wrapped in cloth. "Good morning, class," he said in his usual, brusque manner. "Your last week's essays are graded and on my desk. Mr. Murdoch, would you mind distributing them, please? On the whole, I am not terribly disappointed, although I think most of you can be relieved that Hogwarts does not generally grade on the curve." Jackson carefully set his parcel on the desk. As he unfolded the cloth from around it, James could see that it was a stack of 3 rather small paintings. He thought of the painting of Severus Snape, and his attention perked up. "Today is a day for taking notes, I can assure you," Jackson said ominously. He arranged the paintings in a row along the shelf of the chalkboard. The first painting was of a thin man with owlish glasses and an almost perfectly bald head. He blinked at the class, his expression alert and slightly nervous, as if he expected someone, at any moment, to jump up and shout boom at him. The next painting was empty but for a rather bland wooded background. The last showed a fairly ghastly clown in white face with a hideously large, red smile painted over its mouth. The clown leered inanely at the class and shook a little cane with a ball on the end. The ball, James noticed with a shudder, was a tiny version of the clown's own head, grinning even more insanely. Murdoch finished handing back everyone's papers and slid back into his own seat. James glanced down at his essay. On the front, in Jackson's perfect, left slanting cursive, were the words, tepid, but borderline cogent. "Grammar needs work. As always, questions about your grades may be submitted to me in writing. Further discussion will be obtained, as needed, during my office hours, assuming any of you remember where my office is. And now, onward and upward." Jackson paced slowly along the line of paintings, gesturing vaguely at them. "As many of you will recall, in our first class, we had a short discussion, spearheaded by Mr. Walker." He peered beneath his bushy eyebrows in Zane's direction, about the nature of magical art. "I explained that the artist's intentions are imbued on the canvas via a magical, psychokinetic process, which allows the art to take on a semblance of motion and attitude. The result is a drawing that moves and mimics life at the whim of the artist. Today, we will examine a different kind of art, one that represents life in a wholly different way. Quills scratched feverishly as the class struggled to keep up with Jackson's monologue. As usual, Jackson paced as he spoke. The art of magical painting comes in two forms. The first one is just a more lavish version of what I'd illustrated in class, which is the creation of purely fanciful imagery based on the imagination of the artist. This is different from Muggle art only inasmuch as the magical versions may move and emote, based on the intention, and only within the imaginative boundaries, of the artist. Our friend, Mr. Biggles here, is an example. Jackson gestured at the painting of the clown. Mr. Biggles, thankfully, never existed outside the imagination of the artist who painted him. The clown responded to the attention, bobbing in its frame, waggling the fingers of one white-gloved hand and waving the cane in the other. The tiny clown's head on the end of the cane ran its tongue out and crossed its eyes. Jackson glared at the thing for a moment, and then sighed as he began to pace again. The second type of magical painting is much more precise. It depends on advanced spell work and potion-mixed paints to recreate a living individual or creature. The technomantic name for this type of painting is imagoe speculum, which means, "Can anyone tell me?" Petra raised her hand and Jackson nodded at her. "It means, I think, something like a living mirror image, sir?" Jackson considered her answer. Half credit, Miss Morgenstern. 5 points to Gryffindor for effort. The most accurate definition of the term is a magical painting that captures a living imprint of the individual it represents, but confined within the itis, or time frame, of the subject's own lifetime. The result is a portrait that, while not containing the living essence of the subject, mirrors every intellectual and emotional characteristic of that subject. Thus, the portrait does not learn and evolve beyond the subject's death, but retains exactly that subject's personality is strictly defined by his or her lifetime. We have Mr. Cornelius Yarrow here as an example. Jackson now indicated the thin, rather nervous man in the portrait. Yarrow flinched slightly at Jackson's gesture. Mr. Biggles capered frantically in his frame, jealous for attention. "Mr. Yarrow, when did you die?" Jackson asked, passing the portrait on his way around the room again. The portrait's voice was as thin as the man in it, with a high, nasal tone. "September 20th, 1949. I was 67 years and 3 months old, rounding up, of course." "And what, as if I needed to ask, was your occupation?" "I was Hogwarts school bursar for 32 years, the portrait answered with a sniff. Jackson turned to look at the painting. "And what do you do now?" The portrait blinked nervously. "Excuse me?" "With all the time you now have on your hands, I mean. It's been a long time, since 1949. What do you do with yourself, Mr. Yarrow? Have you developed any hobbies?" Yarrow seemed to chew his lips, obviously mystified and worried by the question. "I hobbies? No hobbies, as such. And I always just liked numbers. I tend to think about my work. That's what I always did when I wasn't figuring the books. I thought about the budgets, the numbers, and worked them out in my head." Jackson maintained eye contact with the painting. "You still think about the numbers? You spend your time working out the books for the school budget as it stood in 1949? Yarrow's eyes darted back and forth over the class. He seemed to feel he was being trapped somehow. Yes. Yes, I do. It's just what I do, you understand. What I always did. I see no reason to stop. I'm the bursar, you see. Well, was, of course. The bursar. Thank you very much, Mr. Yarrow. You've illustrated my point precisely, said Jackson, resuming his circuit of the room. Always happy to be of service, Yarrow said a little stiffly. Jackson addressed the class again. Mr. Yarrow's portrait, as some of you probably know, normally hangs in the corridor just outside the headmistress' office, along with many other former school staff members and faculty. We have, however, come into possession of a second portrait of Mr. Yarrow, one that normally hangs in his family's home. The second portrait, as you may guess, is here in the center of our display. Mr. Yarrow, if you please. Jackson gestured at the empty portrait in the center. Yarrow raised his eyebrows. "H.M.? No." "Yes, of course." He shifted, stood, brushed some non-existent flecks of lint off his natty robes, and then stepped carefully out of the portrait frame. For a few seconds, both portraits stood empty, then Yarrow appeared in the center portrait. He was wearing slightly different clothes in this portrait, and when he sat, he was turned at an angle, showing the prow of his nose in profile. "Thank you again, Mr. Yarrow," Jackson said, leaning against his desk and crossing his arms. Although there are exceptions, typically, a portrait only becomes active upon the death of the subject. Technomancy cannot explain to us why this should be, except that it seems to respond to the law of conservation of personalities. In other words, one Mr. Cornelius Yarrow at any given moment is, cosmically speaking, sufficient. There was a murmur of suppressed laughter. Yarrow frowned as Jackson continued. Another factor that comes into play once the subject is deceased is the interactivity between portraits. If there is more than one portrait of an individual, the portraits become connected, sharing a common subject. The result is one mutual portrait that can maneuver at will between its frames. For instance, Mr. Yarrow can visit us at Hogwarts, and then return to his home portrait as he wishes. James struggled to write all of Jackson's comments down, knowing the professor was notorious for creating test questions out of the least detail of a lecture. He was distracted from the task, however, by thoughts of the portrait of Severus Snape. James risked raising his hand. Jackson spied him, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "A question, Mr. Potter?" "Yes, sir. Can a portrait ever leave its own frames? Can it maybe go over into a different painting?" Jackson studied James for a moment, his eyebrows still raised. "Excellent question, Mr. Potter. Let us find out, shall we? Mr. Yarrow, may I beg your service once more?" Yarrow was trying to maintain the pose of his second portrait, which was studious and thoughtful, looking slightly away. His eyes slid to the side, looking out at Jackson. "I suppose so. How else may I help? Are you aware of the painting of the rather odious Mr. Biggles in the frame next to you?" Mr. Biggles responded to the mention of his name by feigning great shock and shyness. He covered his mouth with one hand and batted his eyes. The tiny clown's head on the end of the cane goggled and blew raspberries. Yarrow sighed. "I am aware of that painting, yes. Would you be so kind as to step into his painting for just a moment, sir?" Yarrow turned to Jackson, his watery eyes magnified behind his spectacles. "Even if that were possible, I don't believe I could bring myself to join his company. I'm sorry." Jackson nodded, closing his eyes respectfully. "Thank you. Yes, I don't blame you, Mr. Yarrow. No, we can see, therefore, that while a much stronger magic is required to create the imago id speculum, it isn't designed to allow the portrait to enter a painting of a purely imaginary subject. It would be, in a sense, like trying to force yourself through a drawing of a door. On the other hand, Mr. Biggles?" The clown jumped up ecstatically at the mention of its name again, then looked at Jackson with a caricature of intense attention. Jackson spread an arm toward the middle frame. "Please join Mr. Yarrow in his portrait, won't you?" Cornelius Yarrow looked shocked, then horrified, as the clown leaped out of its own painting and into his. Mr. Biggles landed behind Yarrow's chair, grabbing it and nearly rocking Yarrow out of it. Yarrow spluttered as Biggles leered forward, his head over Yarrow's left shoulder, the miniature clown's head cane over his right, blowing raspberries into the man's ear. "Professor Jackson." Yarrow exclaimed, his voice rising an octave and trembling on the verge of inaudibility. I insist you remove this fevered imagining from my portrait at once. The class erupted into gales of laughter as the clown leaped over Yarrow's shoulder and landed on his lap, throwing both arms around the man's skinny neck. The clown's head cane kissed Yarrow repeatedly on the nose. Mr. Biggles, Jackson said loudly, that's enough. Please return to your own painting. The clown seemed disinclined to obey. He threw himself off Yarrow's lap and hid elaborately behind the man's chair. Biggles' eyes peeped over Yarrow's right shoulder, the miniature head peeped over his left. Yarrow turned and swatted at the clown prissily, as if it were a spider he was loath to touch but anxious to kill. Jackson produced his wand, a 12-inch length of hickory, from his sleeve and pointed it carefully at the clown's empty frame. Shall I alter your environment while you are away, Mr. Biggles? You'll need to return to it eventually. Would you prefer to find it stocked with a few more Japanese thorn thickets? The clown frowned petulantly under its makeup and stood. Sulking, it clambered out of Yarrow's portrait and back into its own frame. A simple rule of thumb, Jackson said, watching the clown give him a very enthusiastic, nasty look. A one-dimensional personality can merge into a two-dimensional personality's environment, but not the other way around. Portraits are confined to their own frames, while imaginary subjects can move freely into and through any other painting in their general vicinity. Does that answer your question, Mr. Potter? Yes, sir, James answered, then rushed on. One more thing, though. Can a portrait ever appear in more than one of its frames at once? Jackson smiled at James while simultaneously furrowing his brow. Your inquisitiveness on the subject knows no bounds, it seems, Mr. Potter. As a matter of fact, that is possible, although it is a rarity. For great wizards, whose portraits have been duplicated many times, there has been known to be some division of the personality, allowing the subject to appear in multiple frames at once. Such is the case with your Albus Dumbledore, as you might guess. This phenomenon is very difficult to measure and, of course, depends entirely on the skill of the witch or wizard whose likeness appears in the portrait. Is that all, Mr. Potter? Professor Jackson, sir, a different voice asked. James turned to see Philia Goyle near the back, her hand raised. Yes, Miss Goyle, Jackson said, sighing. If I understand correctly, the portrait knows everything that the subject knew, yes? I believe that is apparent, Miss Goyle. The painting reflects the personality, knowledge, and experiences of the subject. No more and no less. Does a portrait, then, make its subject immortal? Philia asked. Her face, as always, was stoic and impassive. I am afraid you are confusing what appears to be with what is, Miss Goyle, Jackson said, eyeing Philia closely, and that is a dreadful mistake for a witch to make. Much of magic, and much of life in general, I might add, is concerned primarily with illusion. The ability to separate illusion from reality is one of the fundamental basics of technomancy. No, a portrait is merely a representation of the once living subject, no more alive than your own shadow where it falls on the ground. It can in no way be thought to prolong the life of the deceased subject. Despite all appearances, a wizard portrait is still merely paint on canvas. As Jackson finished speaking, he turned toward the painting of Mr. Biggles. With one swift movement, he pointed his wand at the painting, not even quite looking at it. A jet of clear, yellowish liquid spurted from the end of the wand and splashed on the canvas. Instantly, it dissolved the paint. Mr. Biggles stopped moving as his image blurred, then ran freely down the canvas. The unmistakable smell of turpentine filled the room. The class was deadly quiet. Professor Jackson walked slowly behind his desk. I fancied myself a bit of an artist when I was younger, he said, studying the end of his wand as he turned. Mr. Biggles, horrid as he was one of my better works. You may freely guess what kind of life circumstances could lead to my creating such a thing, as I myself have forgotten. I thought Mr. Biggles was long forgotten as well, until I found him in the bottom of a trunk while packing for my journey. I thought, he said, glancing over at the streaky mess that ran out of the frame and dripped to the floor, that this would be a fitting end for him. Jackson sat down at his desk, carefully laying his wand on the blotter in front of him. And now, class, what technomantic truth can we derive from what I've just illustrated? No one moved. Then a hand raised, slowly. Jackson inclined his head. Mr. Murdoch. Murdoch cleared his throat. Don't try to be an artist if you're supposed to be a technomancy teacher, sir. That wasn't quite what I had in mind, Mr. Murdoch, but that is inarguably true as well. No, the truth I was illustrating is that, while a wizard painting, portrait, or otherwise, is indeed still merely paint on canvas, Jackson's gaze searched the class, then settled on James. Only the original artist can destroy his painting. No one or nothing else. The canvas can be slashed, the frame destroyed, the bindings cut, but the painting will endure. It will continue to represent its subject, no matter what happens to it, even in 100 pieces. Only the original artist can destroy that connection, and once he does, it is destroyed forever. As the class was dismissed, James couldn't help slowing as he passed the destroyed painting of Mr. Biggles. The clown's face was nothing more than a muddy gray blur in the center of the canvas. Squiggly streaks of paint ran over the bottom edge of the frame, puddled in the chalk tray, and dripped onto the floor, making a drab spatter of white and bloody red. James shuddered, and then walked on. He thought he'd never look at another wizard painting the same way again. As he made his way to his next class, he passed a painting of several wizards gathered around a gigantic globe. Ironically, James noticed that one of the wizards, a severe man with a black mustache and glasses, was watching him closely. James stopped and leaned in. The wizard's stare became stonier, his eyes piercing. You've got nothing to worry about, James said quietly. I don't even know how to draw. Art is Zane's department. The painted wizard grimaced at him, annoyed, as if James had entirely missed the point. He made a harumphing noise and pointed in the direction James had been walking, as if to say move along, nothing to see here. James resumed his walk to Charm's class, musing idly about the wizard in the painting. He'd looked familiar, but James couldn't quite place him. By the time he entered Professor Flitwick's classroom, James had already forgotten the little painted wizard and his piercing stare. The day of the much ballyhooed first school debate came and James was surprised at how many people were planning to attend. He had assumed debates were typically stodgy little affairs attended only by the teams themselves, some teachers, and a handful of the more academically minded students. By lunch that Friday, though, the debate had generated the sort of boisterous tension that accompanied certain Quidditch matches. The one thing that seemed to be missing, however, was the joking taunts between the supporters. Thanks to the carefully worded banners and signs advertising the debate, the student population had been rather evenly divided between two worldviews that, it seemed, were not compatible on any level. The result was a sullen tension that filled the silences where jests and competitive taunts might otherwise have been. James had not been seriously considering attending the debate. Now, though, he realized that the outcome of the event would very likely affect the entire culture of Hogwarts. For that reason, he felt an obligation to go, as well as a growing curiosity. Besides, if Zane was going to be arguing in front of a large portion of the school populace, partly in defense of Harry Potter, James knew it'd be important that he be there to show his support. After dinner, James joined Ted and the rest of the gremlins as they made their way to the event, along with much of the rest of the student populace. The debate was held in the amphitheater, where the occasional play and concert were usually performed. James had never been in the amphitheater before. The open-air seating area, carved out of the hillside behind the East Tower, descended in steep terraces down to a large stage. As James made his way through the crowded arch that opened onto the top tier of seating, he saw that the stage below was nearly empty. A high-backed, official-looking chair sat in the center rear of the stage, flanked by 2 podiums and 2 long tables, with chairs arranged along their backs. Professor Flitwick was on stage, guiding a phosphorus globe into the air with his wand, placing it among several others that lit the stage at strategic locations. The orchestra pit had been covered over with a great wooden platform, and then arranged with a library table and 6 chairs. Zane had explained that the judges would sit there. The noise of the crowd of students was a hushed babble, nearly lost in the normal evening noises emanating from the dim hills and the nearby forest. Ted, Sabrina, and Damien led the way into a row halfway up the middle section, joining a group of other Gryffindors. Noah was already there. He waved at James as they found their seats. "Gremlin salute," Noah said, performing, with a straight face, a complicated series of hand gestures that involved a traditional hand to the forehead salute, a raised fist, a waggle of both elbows that looked a bit like a chicken dance, and ended with both hands framing the sides of his face. Pinky and thumbs extended, apparently mimicking gremlin ears. Ted nodded, responding with only the gremlin ear gesture, which was apparently the countersign. "Have our friends from W come through for us?" Noah nodded. "We ran a small test this afternoon under controlled circumstances. Looks even better than we hoped." And, he added, grinning, they provided their services free of charge. George sent a note with the package, asking only that we tell him exactly how it turns out. Ted smiled, rather humorlessly. "We'll give him a full report either way." James nudged Ted. "What's going on?" "James, my boy," Ted said, scanning the crowd, "do you know what the term plausible deniability means?" James shook his head. "No." "Ask your buddy, Zane. It was invented by the Americans. Let's just say, sometimes, it's best not to know anything until after the fact." James shrugged, figuring he was sitting close enough to the action to know, probably before anyone else, what the gremlins were up to. Someone nearby had a small wireless tuned to the Wizarding wireless network. The tiny voice on the speaker burbled away, forming part of the background noise, until James heard the phrase "crowded amphitheater." He swept his gaze over the groups clustered near the stage, and then saw what he was looking for. A tall man wearing a purple bowler hat was speaking into the tip of his wand. The cadence of his speech blew small, smoky puffs off the end of his wand, the puffs forming the shapes of words as they floated through the air. On a small table near the man was a machine that looked somewhat like an old-fashioned record player with a huge funnel. The wispy word shapes were sucked into the funnel as fast as they flowed off the man's wand. James had never seen a magical broadcast in action. He read the words the wizard was speaking a second before they were broadcast to the nearby wireless. The curious and the contentious alike seemed to have gathered in droves for tonight's contest, the announcer said, illustrating the ongoing debate all around the wizarding world these days, as doubts about ministry policy and or practices meet questions regarding recent magical history. Tonight, via this special broadcast of Current Wizards Newswatch, we will see what one of the country's foremost centers of magical learning thinks of this divisive issue. I'm your host, Myron Madrigal, speaking on behalf of tonight's sponsor, Wimnet's Wand Polish and Enchant Enhancer. Better spells come from a Wimnet wand. We'll be right back for opening comments after this important message. The announcer twirled a finger at an assistant, who plugged the funnel with a large plunger, then spindled a record into the device. A commercial for Wimnet Wand Polish began to play on the nearby wireless. James had been concerned about the debate being broadcast to the wizarding world at large, but then decided it was better than having it parsed and reported in bits by someone like Rita Skeeter. At least this way, all the arguments would be heard in their entirety. He could only hope that Zane, Petra, and their team would argue well against Tabitha Corsica and her carefully woven agenda of doubts and half-truths. Just as the commercial on the nearby wireless ended, Benjamin Franklin approached the left-side podium on stage. On the wireless, the announcer's voice spoke in a hushed tone. In a daring turn of events, the Chancellor of the American Wizarding School, Alma Daleron, Benjamin Amadeus Franklin, has been asked to officiate tonight's debate. He approaches the podium. "Good evening, friends, students, guests," Franklin said, foregoing his wand and raising his clear, tenor voice. "Welcome to this, Hogwarts inaugural all-school debate. My name is Benjamin Franklin, and I am honored to have been chosen to introduce tonight's teams. Without further delay, will teams A and B take their places on the stage?" A group of 10 people stood from the front row. The group split, half ascending the stage on the right side and half on the left. They filed into the chairs behind the 2 tables as Franklin introduced them. Team A consisted of Zane, Petra, Jennifer Tellis, a Hufflepuff named Andrew Hubbard, and an Alma Daleron student named Gerald Jones. Team B was, not surprisingly, mostly 5th to 7th year Slytherins, including Tabitha Corsica, her crony, Tom Sawyer, and 2 others, Heather Flack and Nolan Beetlebrick. The 5th person at the table, and the only one younger than 15, was Ralph. He sat in his chair as rigid as a statue, staring at Franklin as if he was hypnotized. Tonight's debate, Franklin continued, adjusting his square spectacles, as can be assumed by the turnout and the press coverage, deals with subjects both weighty and far-reaching. It has been said that dissent is the greatest expression of freedom, and that debate and discourse are the fuel for a right-thinking populace to maintain a fair government. These are the axioms that define us, and tonight, we will see them in action. Let us all assume an attitude of respect and reason, regardless of our own opinions, so that what flows tonight does so in a manner befitting this school and all who have passed through its halls. No matter the outcome, Franklin turned at this point, acknowledging the 2 debate teams seated on either side. "Let us leave here as we entered, friends, classmates, and fellow witches and wizards." There was a round of applause which, James thought, sounded rather more perfunctory than appreciative. Franklin produced a paper from his robes and examined it. As was determined earlier this evening by lots, he called out in an official voice, "Team B is first to offer opening statements. Miss Tabitha Corsica, I believe, will represent." "Miss Corsica." Franklin backed away from the podium, taking a seat in the high-backed chair at the rear center of the stage. Tabitha approached the left podium, her hands empty. She smiled her wonderful smile at the crowd, seeming to take every person in. One by one. "Friends and classmates, teachers, and members of the press, may I be so bold as to begin by pointing out that the remarks of our esteemed Professor Franklin, in fact, represent the very heart of the error that underlies our discussion tonight." The crowd reacted with something like a mutual gasp or sigh of anticipation. Tabitha took the moment to turn and smile at Benjamin Franklin. "With apologies and respect, Professor." Franklin seemed entirely unperturbed. He raised a hand to her, palm up, and nodded. "Do tell," the gesture seemed to say. Of course, decorum and respect must rule the day during a discourse like this, Tabitha said, returning her attention to the audience. In that respect, we couldn't agree more with the professor. No, the error lies in Professor Franklin's last sentence. He encourages us, most of all, to remember that we are all, in the end, fellow witches and wizards. Friends, is this the essential basis of our identity? If so, then I contend that we are the worst of tyrants, the lowest form of bigot. For are we not, beneath the wands and the spells, more human than witch or wizard? To allow ourselves to be primarily defined by our magic is to deny the humanity we share in common with the non-magical world. Worse, it relegates, by omission, the rest of humanity to a status both lower and less important than our own. Now, I do not ascribe these prejudices to Professor Franklin in particular. These prejudices are as ingrained into the methods and manners of current wizarding policy as magic is ingrained into a broomstick. It is not the innate belief of the magical world that Muggle humanity is inferior to our own, but it is the unfortunate and inevitable result of current ministry policies. Our argument tonight is that the assumptions of the current ruling class have led to this prejudice. Those assumptions are threefold. The first is that the law of secrecy is a necessary safeguard against a Muggle world supposedly incapable of dealing with our existence. While possibly necessary in a past age, we maintain that the law of secrecy is now obsolete, resulting only in a segregated society that unfairly denies both the wizarding and the Muggle worlds the benefits of each other. The second assumption is that history proves the idea that magical Muggle Congress can only result in war. We will argue that this claim has been vastly orchestrated out of a series of isolated and unconnected historical incidents that, on their own, were unfortunate, but relatively unimportant. The specter of the all-powerful evil wizard seeking world rule has been placed alongside the prejudice of the weak-minded Muggle world, incapable of accepting the existence of magical society. Both of these threats, we assert, have been cultivated by the magical ruling class to maintain a culture of fear, thus cementing their own agenda of power and control. And the final assumption we wish to question is the existence of so-called dark magic. We will argue that dark magic is simply a form of complex, if occasionally dangerous, magic, only considered evil because it was mostly used by those who at one time opposed the current magical ruling class. Dark magic is, in short, an invention of the Aura Department, used to justify the squashing of any individual or group that the ruling class feels threatened by. We assert that these three assumptions form the basis of the policies of prejudice against the Muggle world. Our goal is equality, and nothing less, for Muggles, as well as ourselves. After all, before we are witch or wizard, Muggle, or magical, we are first and foremost human. With that, Tabitha turned and walked back to her seat at the Team B table. There was a moment of rather awed silence, then, to James' dismay, the crowd erupted in applause. James looked around. Not everyone was applauding, but those that were, roughly half, did so with a grim vigor. Outpouring of support from the assembled students, the voice on the wireless could just be heard to say, as Miss Corsica, the picture of composure and assurance, takes her seat. Miss Petra Morgenstern, captain of Team A, now approaches the lectern. Petra arranged a small stack of note cards on the podium as the cheers died away. She looked up, unsmiling. "Ladies and gentlemen, fellow classmates, greetings," she said, her voice crisp and ringing. The members of Team B claim that there are 3 points to their argument, their 3 assumptions. Team A will argue that there is, in actuality, only one assumption that is valid for debate tonight, their other 2 arguments being completely dependent upon it. That assumption is the notion that history, as a science and as a study, is not reliable. Team B must convince us that history, rather than being trustworthy, is a complete fabrication, woven by the whims and deliberate manipulations of a small group of incredibly powerful ruling witches and wizards. These ruling individuals must be powerful indeed, because the history they have allegedly invented is, in fact, still in the memory of many of those still living today. Our parents and grandparents, our teachers, and yes, our leaders. They were there when this supposedly fabricated history took place, much of it right here on these very grounds. Using the logic of Team B, the Battle of Hogwarts either never occurred or occurred so differently as to be completely meaningless. If this is so, then we may well argue their other assumptions, such as the assertion that there is no necessity for the law of secrecy and that dark magic is an invention of the Aura Department. If, however, the historical record of the rise of the Dark Lord and his bloody quest for power and dominion over the Muggle world can be shown to be accurate, the rest of Team B's claims fall as well. Thus, we will spend our energies on that argument only, with apologies to Team B. There was another moment of charged silence, precipitated by the mention of the Dark Lord, then another burst of applause, equal in volume to the previous, but scattered with exuberant whoops and whistles. A short but pithy opening statement by Miss Morgenstern, the announcer's voice said. James saw the man in the purple bowler and read his words as they flowed from his wand to the broadcasting funnel. Apparently crafted on the spot as a response to Miss Corsica's threefold outline. This promises to be a direct and spirited dialogue, ladies and gentlemen. For the next 40 minutes, members of each team took to the podiums, offering argument and counter-argument, all timed and officiated by Professor Franklin. The audience had been instructed to refrain from applause, but this had proven impossible to prevent. Once one round of applause had been sounded for a team's argument, it seemed incumbent upon supporters of the opposing viewpoint to cheer their own side as well. Night descended on the amphitheater, ominously dark, with only a thin sickle moon low on the horizon. Enchanted lanterns floated over the stairs and archways, leaving the seating areas in shadow. The stage glowed in the center, lit like noonday in the glow of Professor Flitwick's gently floating phosphorus globes. Zane faced off against Heather Flack, debating the assertion that recorded histories were always manufactured by the victors. I'm from the United States, you know, Zane said, addressing Heather Flack across the stage. If your statement is true, it's a remarkable thing that I've ever learned anything about my country's occasionally terrible past, from our treatment of Native Americans, to the Salem witch hunts, to the one-time institution of slavery. If the victors fabricate our histories, how is it that I know that even Thomas Jefferson once owned slaves? Benjamin Franklin winced at that, then nodded slowly, approvingly. The supporters of Team A applauded uproariously. Finally, with no clear outcome, the captains of both teams approached the podiums for final arguments. Tabitha Corsica still had first option. I appreciate, she began, glancing at Petra, that my opponent in this debate has made it a point to restrict discussion to this one central tenet, that the recent history of the wizarding world has been enhanced and stylized to instill terror of some fabled, monstrous enemy. To be specific, they have continuously raised the image of the Dark Lord, as they prefer to call him. If Miss Morgenstern wishes to evade the other valid facets of tonight's discussion, I will concur. If, that is, she is willing to debate the details of the one figure around whom all the other details revolve. Let us discuss the treatment of Lord Tom Riddle. A distinct gasp of surprise and awe washed over the crowd at the mention of Voldemort's name. Even for Tabitha Corsica, James thought, bringing up Tom Riddle seemed like a terrible risk, even if he was, in fact, the heart of the issue. James sat forward in his seat, his heart pounding. The Dark Lord, as the Orier department likes to call Tom Riddle, Tabitha said into the hushed darkness, was indeed a powerful wizard, and perhaps even a misguided one. Overzealous, he may have been. But what, really, do we know for sure about his plans and his methods? Miss Morgenstern will simply tell you he was evil. He was a dark wizard, she will say, intent only on power and death. But really, do such people even exist? In comic books, perhaps? And in the minds of those who breed fear. But is anyone, in reality, utterly and irredeemably evil? No. I suggest that perhaps Tom Riddle was a misguided but well-meaning wizard whose desire for muggle wizard equality was simply too radical a notion for the magical ruling class to allow. The powers that be put together a very careful campaign of half-truths and outright lies, all designed to discredit Riddle's ideas and demonize his followers, whom the ministry-controlled media dubbed Death Eaters. Despite this, Riddle's reformers were eventually able to win enough confidence to assume control of the Ministry of Magic for a short time. Only after a vicious and bloody coup were the old powers able to defeat Riddle and his reformers, killing Tom Riddle in the process and defaming what he stood for as mercilessly as they could. As Tabitha spoke, a grumbling spread around the assembled crowd. The grumbling grew into isolated shouts of outrage, then calls of "let her speak." Finally, just as she finished, the crowd erupted into an agitated frenzy that James found frightening. He glanced around. Many students had stood and were shouting through cupped hands. Several had climbed onto their seats, stomping or shaking fists. James couldn't tell who, among the crowd, was shouting for or against Tabitha. At the height of the disturbance, James had a vague sense of Ted Lupin and Noah Metzger huddling around something. Suddenly, there was a burst of blinding light between them, throwing them into stark silhouette. The light shot upwards, filling the amphitheater with its glow. At about 100 feet, the ball of light exploded into a million tiny lights. The crowd hushed, bewildered, every eye tilted up. The tiny lights swam together, forming shapes. There was a collective gasp as the lights formed the huge shape of the legendary Dark Mark, a skull with a snake squirming out of the mouth. Then, almost instantly, the shape was overwhelmed by a stylized lightning bolt shape. The lightning bolt seemed to strike the skull, which bit the snake in half. The front half of the snake rolled over dead, its eyes turning to little crosses, and then the skull broke in half. The lightning bolt vanished as a sign popped up out of the broken skull: "You'll laugh your skull off at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes." Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade locations. Custom orders, our specialty. There was a long, silent moment of complete bewilderment as everyone stared up at the glittering letters. Then the letters broke apart and fell, showering prettily into the amphitheater. There was a titter of laughter somewhere. "Well," Professor Franklin said, having stood and moved center stage, "that was, I must admit, a well-timed, if somewhat puzzling, diversion." There was some scattered, embarrassed laughter. Slowly, people began to resume their seats. James turned toward Ted and Noah, who were squinting and looking dazed, blinded by the Weasley brothers' special order fireworks. "Bloody Weasleys made a public service announcement out of it," Ted muttered. Noah shrugged. "Guess that's why it was free of charge." "Ladies and gentlemen," Franklin continued, "this is indeed a subject of much passion for many of us, but we must not allow ourselves to become carried away. Miss Corsica has made some assertions that are, to many of us, very difficult to hear. However, this is a debate, and where I come from, we do not," he said with great emphasis, "squash debate simply because an argument makes us uncomfortable. I hope we can complete this discussion with dignity, otherwise, I am sure the headmistress will agree with me that postponing final arguments will be the only recourse. Miss Morgenstern, I believe you had the floor." Franklin sat back down, and James sensed that he was far angrier than he was letting on. Petra stood behind her podium for several seconds, eyes down. Finally, she looked up, obviously shaken. "I admit I don't know quite where to begin in responding to Miss Corsica's frankly incredible hypothesis. The Dark Lord was not merely evil because it was convenient for those in power to call him so. He used unspeakable methods to gain and maintain power. He was known for freely using, and for instructing his followers to use, all three unforgivable curses. Lord Voldemort was no more interested in Muggle equality than. Then. She stopped, fumbling. James pressed his lips together furiously. He felt for her. There were so many lies to address. Any that slipped past would be touted as truths she was reluctant to admit. "Miss Morgenstern," Tabitha said, her voice beseeching, "do you have any basis for these claims, or are you simply repeating the things you've been told?" Petra looked over at Tabitha, her face pale and furious. "Only the totality of recorded history, and the living memories of those who experienced it firsthand," she spat. "It is incumbent on you, I suggest, to provide proof for your claims that Lord Voldemort was anything other than what all of accepted record tells us he was." "Since you mention that," Tabitha said smoothly, "I believe that there are individuals here this evening who were first-hand witnesses to the Battle of Hogwarts. We could settle accounts right now, if we desired, by interviewing them in person. This is not a courtroom, though, so I will merely ask the following. Can anyone in attendance, anyone who was there at the battle, deny that Lord Tom Riddle himself stated for all to hear that he deplored the loss of any blood in battle? Can anyone deny that he pleaded with his enemies to meet with their leader personally, so that violence could be avoided? Tabitha peered out over the audience. There was perfect silence but for the distant drone of the crickets and the creak of wind in the trees of the forbidden forest. No, none deny it because it is the truth, she said, almost kindly. Many died, of course. But it is a matter of fact that many more died than Lord Tom Riddle desired. All because those who opposed him could not bear for him to be known as anything other than a murderous madman. Petra had regained her composure. She spoke now, clearly and strongly. And is it the act of a peace-loving reformer to seek out and personally murder the family of an infant, then attempt to murder the infant as well? You speak of Harry Potter, then? Tabitha said, not missing a beat. The man who, ironically, happens to be the head of the Orier department. You deny it is true, then? I deny nothing. I simply question and challenge. I suggest only that the truth is a far more complex thing than we have been allowed to believe. I submit that allegations of cold-blooded murder and attacks on children, all of which are rather conveniently unprovable, factor very well into the doctrine of fear that has ruled us these past 20 years. How dare you? James heard his own voice before he realized he meant to speak. He was standing, pointing at Tabitha Corsica, trembling with rage. How dare you call my dad a liar? That monster killed his parents. My grandparents are dead because of him, and you stand there and tell us that it's some sort of made-up story. How dare you? His voice cracked. I'm sorry, Tabitha said, and her face was, indeed, a portrait of compassion. I know you believe that is true, James. Professor Franklin had stood and was moving forward, but James shouted again before Franklin could speak. My dad killed your great hero, he called, his eyes blurring with tears of rage. That monster tried to kill my dad twice, the second time because my dad gave himself to him. Your great savior was a monster, and my dad finally defeated him. Your father, Tabitha said, her voice rising and becoming stern, was a half-rate wizard with a good PR department. If it wasn't for the fact that he'd been surrounded by greater wizards than himself at every turn, we wouldn't even know his name today. At that, the crowd exploded again, angry outbursts and shouts filling the space like a cauldron. There was a clatter on stage. James looked and saw that Ralph, who'd never even spoken, had jumped up, knocking over his chair. Tabitha turned and looked at him, and he met her eyes for a second. Sit down, she mouthed at him, her eyes livid. Ralph returned her glare, then turned resolutely and left the stage. James saw it, and even in the midst of his anguish and fear at the nearly rioting crowd, his heart rejoiced. There was no point in continuing the debate any further. Headmistress McGonagall joined Professor Franklin on the stage and both shot red flares from their wands, restoring order to the amphitheater. With no preamble, the headmistress instructed all the students to return immediately to their common rooms. Her face was stern and very pale. As the crowd muttered and grumbled, funneling through the arched entryway back into the castle proper, James saw Ralph working toward him through the crowd. He moved aside until the larger boy caught up. I can't do it anymore, Ralph said to James, his voice low and his eyes downcast. I'm sorry, she said, those terrible, stupid things. You can keep hating me if you want, but I just can't keep up with all this progressive element rubbish. I don't know anything about it, really, except that it's just too much work to be so political. James couldn't help grinning. Ralph, you're a brick. I don't hate you. I should apologize to you. Well, let's apologize later, okay? Ralph said, working his way toward the archway with James following in his wake. Right now, I just want to get out of here. Tabitha Corsica has been staring holes into me ever since I left the stage. Besides, Zane says that Ted's invited us to hang out in your common room. He wants to gloat over having won over a member of Team B. That won't bother you? James asked. Not, Ralph replied, shrugging, it's worth it. Gryffindors have better snacks. 10. Holiday at Grimmauld Place. The next Monday, James, Zane, and Ralph stood outside the door of Headmistress McGonagall's Advanced Transfiguration class until the last of her students left and she was gathering her things. Come in, she called to the three boys without looking up. Stop lurking outside the door like vultures. How may I help you? Madam Headmistress, James began tentatively, we want to talk to you about the debate. Do you? Now, she asked, glancing up at James for a moment, then shouldering her bag. Why, I cannot begin to imagine. The sooner we can all forget that fiasco, the better. The boys scrambled to follow the headmistress as she strode toward the door. But nobody is forgetting it, madam, James said quickly. It was all anybody talked about the whole weekend. People are getting really stirred up about it. There was almost a fight out in the courtyard yesterday, when Must-Run Jewel heard Remus Macmillan call Tabitha Corsica a lying twit. If Professor Longbottom hadn't been nearby, Must-Run probably would have killed Remus. This is a school, Mr. Potter, and a school is, in its simplest form, a place where young people gather. Young people are occasionally prone to have spats. This is why, among other reasons, Hogwarts employs Mr. Filch. It wasn't a spat, madam, Ralph said, following the headmistress out into the corridor. They were really mad. Daft mad, if you know what I mean. People are coming unglued about this whole business. Then, like Mr. Potter says, it is fortunate Professor Longbottom was nearby. I fail to see, precisely, why this is your problem. Zane trotted to keep up with the headmistress' stride. Well, the thing is, ma'am, we're just wondering why you're letting it all go on. I mean, you were there when the battle took place. You know what this Voldemort guy was like. You could just tell everyone how it was and put Tabitha in her place, neat as you please. McGonagall stopped suddenly, leaving the boys to scramble to a halt near her. What, may I ask, would you three wish me to do? She said, dropping her voice and looking at each one intently. The truth about the Dark Lord and his followers has been common knowledge for 30 years, ever since he murdered your grandparents, Mr. Potter. Do you suppose that my repeating it one more time will dispel all the revisionist rabble-rousing that has been going on, not only at this school, but throughout the wizarding world? Her eyes were like diamond chips as she glared at them. James realized that she was, if anything, even more agitated about the debate than they were. And suppose I summon Miss Corsica to my office and forbid her from disseminating these lies and distortions? Do you expect that this progressive element of theirs will simply give up? How long do you suppose it would be before we'd be reading an article in the Daily Prophet about how the administration of Hogwarts is working with the Auror Department to stifle the free exchange of ideas on school grounds? James was stunned. He had assumed that the headmistress was indulging Tabitha Corsica for some reason, allowing, for a time, her charade to continue. It simply hadn't occurred to him that McGonagall might not, in fact, be capable of addressing the matter without making it worse. So what do we do, ma'am? James asked. We? McGonagall said, raising her eyebrows. My dear James, I admit that you amaze and impress me. Despite what you may believe, the future of the wizarding world does not, in fact, rest upon you and your two friends' shoulders. She saw the annoyed grimace on his face, and then she showed him one of her rare smiles. She bent a bit to speak more conspiratorially, addressing all three boys. The revived memory of the Dark Lord is not an overlarge concern to those of us who once faced the living thing. This is a whim in the mind of a fickle populace, and irritating as it may be, it will pass. In the meantime, what you three can do is attend your classes, do your homework, and continue to be the sharp-witted and strong-hearted boys you obviously are. And if anyone around you tries to say Tom Riddle was a better man than Harry Potter, you have my permission, my instruction, even, to transfigure their pumpkin juice into Nurgle water. She eyed the three boys seriously, one by one. Just tell them I prescribed you to practice that particular spell. Understood? Zane and Ralph grinned at each other. James sighed. McGonagall nodded curtly, straightened herself, and continued briskly on her way. After 5 steps, she turned back. So, and boys? Yes, ma'am. Zane said. 2 sharp flicks and the word Nurglemonias. Emphasis on the first and third syllables. Yes, ma'am. Zane replied again, grinning. The school year descended through autumn, approaching the winter holidays. The football field became carpeted with leaves, crunching and kicking up under the feet of Professor Curry's Muggle Studies teams. The unofficial football tournament ended with James' team winning. James himself scored the winning goal, his 3rd of the day, against bully Horace Birch, the Ravenclaw gremlin. His team collected around him, jumping and hollering as if they just won the house cup. In fact, the winning team's house was rewarded 100 points by Professor Curry, that being the best prize she could offer. The team circled James, heaving him onto their shoulders and carrying him into the courtyard as if he had just returned from slaying a dragon. He grinned hugely, his cheeks beat red in the chilly autumn wind, and his spirits were higher than they'd been all year. The routine of classes and homework, which had been daunting during the first weeks, became dull and predictable. Professor Jackson assigned endless dreaded essays and sprung unsuspecting pop quizzes on his class every couple of weeks. Zane told James and Ralph amusing tales of confrontations between Professor Trelawney and Madame Delacroix during his Tuesday night Constellations Club, which, like divination class, both professors managed to share. On the Quidditch pitch, James continued to advance his broom skills with the help of both Ted and Zane until he began to feel cautiously confident that he might, indeed, make the Gryffindor team next year. He began to imagine how rich it might be to show up at tryouts next spring and wildly surpass everyone's memories of his first-year attempts. Zane, for his part, continued to fly remarkably well for the Ravenclaws. Calling on his rather unique Muggle background, he invented a move he called buzzing the tower, in which he'd hit a bludger around the press box, letting it gather speed as it circled back, then meet it on the other side, striking it again to add even more speed and a bit of direction. Using that trick, he had managed to knock 2 players completely off their brooms, leading to a few apologetic visits to the hospital wing. Life for Ralph in the Slytherin house had been rough for a while. Tabitha had never actually spoken to him about his desertion of the debate stage or his abandoning of the progressive element meetings. James and Zane figured she'd ceased having any use for him when he'd returned to being James' friend. Eventually, the older Slytherins simply forgot about Ralph, apart from a few cool stares or snide remarks in the Slytherin common room. Then, surprisingly, Ralph began to befriend some other first- and second-year Slytherins. Unlike the blue badge wearers, none of them seemed all that interested in the broader world of politics and causes. To be sure, there was a sort of shifty guile to even the first-year Slytherins, but a couple of them seemed to genuinely like Ralph, and even James had to admit they were funny, in a double-edged sort of way. Defense against the dark arts became a favorite class of James, Zane, and Ralph. Professor Franklin taught a very practical class, with many exciting stories and real-life examples from his own long and wildly various adventures. James, to no one's surprise, was a very good dueler. He admitted, with a sheepish grin, that he'd been taught quite a lot of defensive technique by his dad. Nobody, however, including James, was willing to go up against Ralph in a duel. Ralph's wand skills seemed remarkably haphazard when it came to defensive spellcasting. The first time he dueled, Ralph had attempted a simple Expelliarmus spell on Victoire. He struck out with his wand, a bit wildly, and a bolt of blue lightning had erupted from the end, singeing Victoire's hair so that a ragged bald strike ran straight across the top of her head. She patted at it with her hand, then her eyes nearly boggled out of her head. She screamed in rage and had to be restrained by 3 other students from tackling Ralph, who was 3 times her size. Ralph backed away, apologizing profusely, his wand still smoking. Only once, during an evening in the Ravenclaw common room, did anyone have the temerity to mention anything to James, Zane, and Ralph about the debate. They were just finishing their homework when a large 4th year named Gregory Templeton sat down at the table across from them. "Hey, you were both in that debate, weren't you?" he said, pointing back and forth between Zane and Ralph. "Yeah, Gregory," Zane said, shoving his books into his backpack, his voice betraying his general dislike of the older boy. "You were the one at the table with Corsica, right?" Gregory said, turning to Ralph. "Yeah," Ralph said, "but you tell her from me she's right on the mark, eh? I've been reading a book that tells all about the whole thing. It's called The Dumbledore Plot, and it's all about how the old man and that Harry Potter cooked the whole thing up, start to finish. Did you know they made up the whole story about Riddle and the Horcruxes on the night the old man died? Some even say it was Harry Potter himself killed him, once they'd worked it all out." James struggled to control his temper. He looked levelly at Gregory. "Do you even know who I am?" Zane stared hard at the bottle in Gregory's hand. "Hey," he asked with forced casualness, surreptitiously pulling out his wand, "what's that you're drinking?" 90 seconds later, James, Zane, and Ralph scrambled as Gregory spat Nurgle water all over the common room table. "Practicing," Zane called, ducking under Gregory's grasping arms. "I swear. I was supposed to practice that transfiguration. Your drink just got in the way. Ask McGonagall." The 3 boys successfully ducked from the room, laughing uproariously at the ensuing chaos. By Christmas holiday, James was ready for a break. After lunch on his last day of class, James went up to the Gryffindor sleeping chamber to pack his things. The sky outside the tower window had grown chilly and gray, making him wish for the grand fireplace back at number 12 Grimmauld Place and one of Creature's very complicated hot chocolates, which consisted, at last count, of 14 unnamed ingredients, including, he had been assured, at least a pinch of actual chocolate. "Hey, James," Ralph's voice called up the stairs, "you up there?" "Yeah." "Come on up, Ralph." "Thanks," Ralph panted, climbing the steps. "I came up after lunch with Petra. She said you'd be here packing. All raring to go, I expect." "Yeah. We're having everyone over to the old headquarters for the holidays this year. Uncles George and Ron, aunts Hermione and Fleur, Ted and his grandmom, Victoire, even Luna Lovegood, who you don't know, but you'd be keen on. She's the weirdest grown-up I've ever met, but in a good way. Mostly. Grandmom and Granddad won't be there, though. They're visiting Charlie and everybody in Prague this year. Still, I think even Neville will be there. Professor Longbottom, I mean." Ralph nodded glumly, staring into James' trunk. "Sounds swell. Yet, well, I hope you have a happy Christmas and all that, then." James stopped packing, remembering that Ralph's dad was traveling for business over the holidays. "So, yeah. So what will you be doing, Ralph? Will you be spending Christmas with your grandparents or something?" Ralph said, glancing up. "So, not. Looks like I'll just be hanging around here for the holidays. Zane's not leaving until next week, so at least I'll have him to hang around with over the weekend. After that, well, I'll figure out something to do with myself." He sighed hugely. "Ralph," James said, tossing a pair of mismatched socks into his trunk. "Do you want to come and have Christmas with my family and me?" Ralph tried to look surprised. "What? No, I'd never want to impose on your big family gathering, what with all the, I couldn't." "No." James frowned. "Ralph, you prat, if you don't come home with me for the holidays, I will personally perform a random transfiguration on you with your own wand. How about that, then?" "Well, you don't have to get pushy about it," Ralph exclaimed, then his face broke into a grin. "Your mom and dad won't mind." "No. To tell you the truth, with all the people that'll be in and out of the place, I'm not sure they'll even notice." Ralph rolled his eyes. "I meant about me being on the wrong side of the debate and everything. They listen to it on the wireless, Ralph." "I know. And you never said a word." Ralph opened his mouth, then closed it. He thought for a moment. Finally, he grinned and plopped onto Ted's bed. "I see your point. So you say Victoire will be there? Don't get any ideas. She's part Vila, She puts the whammy on any guy that gets within 10 feet of her. I just wanted to try to make it up to her somehow. About that whole incident in DAD8. James slammed his trunk. "Ralph, mate, the less you say about that, the better." The next morning, breakfast in the Great Hall was thinly attended. A heavy frost had fallen in the early hours, etching silver fern shapes in the corners of the windows and giving the view beyond a hoary ghostliness. James and Ralph arrived at the same time and found Zane at the Ravenclaw table. "You're a lucky stiff, Ralph," Zane said grumpily, huddling around his coffee cup. "I'm dying to see what a magical Christmas is like." "To tell you the truth," James said, pouring himself a pumpkin juice, "I doubt it'd live up to your imagination." "Maybe you're right. Even at the best of times, I gotta admit, it feels a little like Halloween around here." "Hey, Ralph," James said, nudging the bigger boy, "wait until you see our traditional Christmas parade of ghouls. We'll have candy cane stuffed bats to eat and drink hot chocolate out of elf skulls." Ralph blinked. Zane looked sour and rolled his eyes. Yeah, you're a laugh riot." "Not." "Come on," Ralph said, finally getting the joke. "You'll have a great Christmas with your family. At least, you get to see your mom and dad." "Yeah, sure. An 8-hour flight back to the States with my sister, Greer, bugging me the whole way about life at that crazy magical school. She'll be disappointed that, so far, the only way I can affect things with my wand is to hit them with it. We're not allowed to practice magic out of Hogwarts, anyway," Ralph said instructively. Zane ignored him. "And then Christmas with the grandparents and all my cousins in Ohio. You have no idea what kind of craziness that always is." James couldn't help asking. "How do you mean?" "Imagine the traditional all-American Norman Rockwell Christmas scene, right?" Zane said, holding up his hands as if framing a picture. "Opening presents, and carving turkey, and carols by the Christmas tree." "Got it." Ralph and James nodded, trying not to smile at Zane's grave expression. "All right," Zane went on. "Now imagine hinky punks instead of people. You'll get the idea." James burst out laughing. Ralph, as usual, just blinked and looked back and forth between the two other boys. "That's fantastic," James hooted. Zane smiled reluctantly. "Yeah, well, it is pretty funny, I guess. The screeches and the clawing, all those tiny shreds of wrapping paper flying all over the place, landing in the fireplace and nearly burning the place to the ground." "What's a hinkapunk?" Ralph asked, trying to keep up. "Ask Hagrid next care of magical creatures," James said, still chuckling. "It'll all make sense." Late that morning, Ralph and James said goodbye to Zane, then hauled their trunks out to the courtyard. Ted and Victoire were already there, sitting on their trunks on the top step, framed against the strangely silent, frost-laden grounds. Victoire's hair had been regrown as well as possible by Madame Curio in the hospital wing, but the new hair was just different enough in texture and color to be noticeable. As a result, Victoire had taken to wearing a rather amazing variety of hats. The hats, if anything, enhanced her appearance, but she complained about them at every opportunity. Today, she had donned a small ermine pillbox cap, cocked rakishly over her left eyebrow. She glared coolly at Ralph as he dragged his trunk out onto the step. A few minutes later, Hagrid drove up at the head of a carriage. Ralph's mouth dropped open when he saw that nothing, apparently, was pulling the carriage. "You lot aren't supposed to see these until next year, mind," Hagrid said to James and Ralph. He yanked the brake lever, climbed down, and began heaving their trunks easily onto the back of the carriage. "So be sure to act surprised when ye sees next spring, right?" "So, Hagrid," Victoire said haughtily, "if these awful things are as ugly as Mummy tells me, I'm glad I can't see them, anyway." She held out a hand and Ted took it, helping her rather unnecessarily into the carriage. There were a few other students crammed into the carriage, all similarly late departures for the holidays. Hagrid drove them to Hogsmeade Station, where they boarded the Hogwarts Express again. The train was far emptier than it had been on their arriving journey. The four of them found a compartment near the end, then settled in for the long trip. "So Hogsmeade is a wizard village?" Ralph asked Ted. "Sure is. Home to the Three Broomsticks and Honeyduke's Sweet Shop. Best cockroach clusters in the world. Lots of other shops, too. You'll get to go on Hogsmeade weekends starting your third year." Ralph looked thoughtful, which meant his brow pinched down while his lower lip pushed up, squeezing his entire face toward his nose. "So how do wizards keep muggles out of a magical village? I mean, aren't there any roads or anything?" "Tricky question, mate," Ted said, slouching on his seat and kicking off his shoes. Victoire wrinkled her nose. "You will keep those dirt kickers away from me, Mr. Lupin." Ted ignored her, stretching his legs across the compartment and resting his feet on the opposite seat. "I'm in Old Stonewall's Applied Advanced Technomancy class this semester, and all I can tell you is that places like Hogsmeade aren't just hidden because muggles can't find a road in. It's all quantum." If Petra was here, she could explain it better. James was curious. "What's quantum mean?" Ted shrugged. "It's a joke in AAT. When in doubt, just say quantum dot." He sighed resignedly, gathering his thoughts. "All right, imagine that there are places on the Earth that are like a hole in space patched with rubber, see? You can't tell anything's different from the top, but it's maybe a little bouncy or something. Then, say, some wizard comes along who really knows his quantum. He says, 'Gore, here's a place where we can put up a smashing wizard village.' So what he does is he conjures something sort of like a huge magical weight, but it's really, really tiny, right? And the weight drops into the bit of rubbery reality and pulls it down, down, down. Okay. So the weight punches that rubber reality right out into another dimension, making a funnel in the shape of space-time." "Wait," Ralph said, frowning in concentration. "What's space-time?" "Never mind," Ted said, waving dismissively. "Doesn't matter. It's all quantum. Nobody gets it except for crusty old parchment heads like Professor Jackson. So anyway, there's this funnel in space-time where the way it pushes down on the rubber reality. Muggles, see, can only operate on the surface of reality. They don't see where the funnel dips down into this new dimensional space. To them, it just isn't even there. Magic folk, though, we can follow the funnel down off main space, if we know what to look for and share the secret. So we build places like Hogsmeade there. So Hogsmeade is down in some sort of funnel-shaped valley, Ralph said experimentally. No, Ted said, sitting up again. It's just, a metaphor. The landscape looks just the same, but dimensionally, it goes out through the other side of space-time, where muggles can't go. Lots of wizard places have been built that way. We breed magical creatures in quantum preserves. Whole mountain ranges where the giants live, all buried in quantum, off the muggle maps. That's pretty much how unplottability works. Simple as that. Simple as what? Ralph said, frustrated. Ted sighed. Look, mate, it's like the cockroach clusters in honeydukes. You don't need to understand how they make them. You just need to eat 'em. Ralph slumped. I'm not sure I can do either. This bloke's a real barrel of laughs, isn't he? Ted asked James. So if muggles can't get in, James replied, how'd that muggle get onto the school grounds? So, yeah, Ted said, leaning back again. The mysterious Quidditch intruder. Is that what people are saying now? That he was a muggle? James had forgotten that not everything he knew about the intruder was common knowledge. He recalled now what Neville Longbottom had said about the wild rumors surrounding the mysterious man on the Quidditch pitch. Yeah, he said, trying to sound nonchalant, I heard he may have been a muggle. I was just wondering how a muggle could get in, what with all this stuff about, quantum. Actually, Ted said, squinting out the window at the brightening day, I guess even a muggle could get in if they were accompanied by a wizard or led in somehow. It's not that they can't get in, exactly. It's just that, as far as their senses are concerned, the spaces don't even exist. If a magical person led them in, though, and the muggle pushed through what their senses were telling them. Sure, it'd be possible, I guess. But who'd be stupid enough to do such a thing? James shrugged and looked at Ralph. The look on Ralph's face mirrored what James was thinking. Stupid or not, somebody had indeed led a muggle onto the Hogwarts grounds. How or why that had been arranged was still a mystery, but James intended to do his best to find out. The four of them lunched on sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, taken from the Hogwarts kitchens that morning, then settled into companionable silence. The day became hard and bright, with the sun shining like a diamond over the marching fields and woods. The frost had burned away, leaving the ground raw and gray. The skeletal trees scoured at the sky, standing on carpets of dead leaves. Ralph read and napped. Victoire flipped through a pile of magazines, then wandered off in search of a few friends she suspected were somewhere on board. Ted taught James to play a game called Winkles and Augurs, which involved using wands to levitate a piece of parchment folded into the shape of a fat triangle. According to Ted, both players used their wands, the Winkles, to simultaneously levitate the folded parchment, the augur each one trying to guide the paper into their designated goal area, usually a circle drawn on a piece of parchment and placed near their opponent. James had gotten marginally better at levitation, but he was no match for Ted, who knew just how to undercut James' wand work, bobbing the augur out of range and swooping it onto his goal with a resounding smack. It's all about practice, James, Ted said. I've been playing this since my first year. We've had as many as 4 people on a team sometimes, and used augurs as big as the bust of Godric Gryffindor in the common room. I'm personally responsible for the fact that his left ear's been glued back on. Didn't know the reparo charm back then, and now we've come to rather prefer him that way. By the time the train pulled into platform 9 3/4, dusk had begun to turn the sky a dreamy lilac color. James, Ted, and Ralph waited for the lurch as the train came to a full stop, then stood, stretched, and made their way out to the platform. The porter took their tickets, then produced their trunks with an accio spell, sucking each trunk rather roughly out of the baggage compartment and plunking it at its owner's feet. Victoire caught up with them as they piled their trunks onto a large cart. I'm to escort you all to the old headquarters, Ted said importantly, drawing himself to his full height. It's close enough, and your parents are pretty busy tonight, James, what with everyone else arriving, and Lily and Albus just getting out of school today as well. They filed through the hidden portal that separated platform 9 3/4 from the Muggle platforms of King's Cross Station. You don't drive, Ted, Victoire said reproachfully. And he'll hardly fit the four of us on your broom. What do you expect to do? I suppose you're right, Victoire, Ted said, stopping in the center of the concourse and looking around. Muggle travelers moved around them, hurrying here and there, most bundled into heavy coats and hats. The huge concourse echoed with the sound of train announcements and the tinkly din of recorded Christmas carols. Looks like we're stuck, Ted said mildly. I'd say this is an emergency of sorts, wouldn't you? Ted, no. Victoire scolded as Ted raised his right hand, his wand sticking up out of it. There was a loud crack that echoed all around the concourse, apparently unheard by the milling Muggles. A huge, purple shape shot through the doors framed in the gigantic glass arch at the head of the concourse. It was, of course, the night bus. James had known to expect it when Ted had made the signal, but he'd never known it could travel off-road. The enormous triple-decker bus dodged and squeezed through the oblivious crowd, never losing speed until it squeaked violently to a halt directly in front of Ted. The doors shuttled open and a man in a natty, purple uniform leaned out. Welcome to the night bus, the man said, a bit huffily. Emergency transport for the stranded witch or wizard. You know this is the middle of effing King's Cross Station, don't you? Seems like you could have at least made it to the front step. Evening, Frank, Ted said airily, hoisting Victoire's trunk up to the conductor. It's this bad leg of mine again. Old Quidditch injury. Acts up at the worst of times. Old Quidditch injury my topmost granny's last molar, Frank muttered, stacking the trunks on a shelf just inside the door. You tried pulling that GAF one more time, and I'm going to charge you a galleon just for being a nuisance. Ralph was reluctant to get onto the bus. You say it's close. This headquarters place? Maybe we could, walk. In this cold? Ted replied heartily. And with his bad leg. Frank added sourly. Ralph climbed on and had no sooner crossed the threshold when the doors slammed shut. Corner of Pancras and St. Chad's, Journey, Ted called, grabbing a nearby brass handle. The driver nodded, set his face grimly, gripped the steering wheel as if he meant to wrestle it, then punched the accelerator. Ralph, despite James' advice, had forgotten to grab onto something. The night bus rocketed forward, throwing him backwards onto one of the brass beds that, strangely enough, seemed to occupy the lowest level of the bus instead of seats. Boomph, the sleeping wizard that Ralph had landed on muttered, raising his head from the pillow. Grosvenor Square, already? The bus performed an inconceivably tight hairpin turn, circling a group of tourists who were staring up at the departures board, then rocketed across the concourse again, whipping around businessmen and old ladies like a gust of wind. The glassed arch loomed over them, and James was certain the night bus couldn't possibly fit through the open doorways, large as they were. Then he remembered that the bus had, indeed, come in through those doors. He braced himself. Without slowing, the bus squeezed through the door like a water balloon through a mouse hole, popping out onto the crowded street and swerving wildly. I hear we're having goose for dinner tonight. Ted called to James as the bus careened through a busy intersection. Yeah. James called back. Creature insisted on a full-course meal our first night back. Gotta love that ugly little brute. Ted yelled appreciatively. How's Ralph doing? James glanced around. Ralph was still sprawled on the bed with the sleeping wizard. It's all right, he yelled, clutching the bed with both hands. I threw up in the souvenir sleeping cap they gave me. The night bus screamed around the corner where St. Chad's Street met Argyle Square, then jammed to a halt. If anything, The sudden cessation of motion was as jarring as the ride itself. The gigantic purple bus sat quietly and primly, puttering a dainty cloud of exhaust. The doors shuttled open and Ted, Victoire, James, and Ralph clambered out, the latter a little drunkenly. Frank, despite the rankled look he shot Ted, stacked their trunks carefully on the sidewalk and bid them a happy Christmas. The doors cranked shut and a moment later, the night bus leapt down the street, streaking around a lorry and performing something rather like a pirouette at the intersection. 3 seconds later, it was gone. That worked as well as could be expected, Ted said heartily, grabbing his and Victoire's trunks by the handle and yanking them toward a line of dilapidated row houses. "What number is it?" Ralph said, puffing and dragging his huge trunk. "Number 12. "Right here," James replied. He had been to the old headquarters so many times he'd forgotten that it was invisible to most people. Ralph stopped at the base of the steps, his brow furrowed and frowning. "Oh, yeah," James said, turning around. "Okay, Ralph. You can't see it yet, but it's right here. Number 12 Grimm Old Place, right here, between 11 and 13. It used to belong to my dad's godfather, Sirius Black, but he willed it to Dad. It was the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix, back in the day when they were fighting Voldemort. They buried it with the best secrecy spells and disillusionment charms all the most powerful good wizards at the time could conjure. It was the best kept secret place of the Order, until right at the end, when a Death Eater followed my aunt here using sight-along apparition. Anyway, it officially still belongs to Dad, but we don't live here most of the time. Creature keeps it up when we're not here." "I didn't understand about every third word of that," Ralph said, sighing, "but I'm cold. How do we get in?" James reached down for Ralph's hand. Ralph gave it to him, and James pulled him up onto the first step of the landing leading into number 12. Ralph stumbled, regained his footing, and looked up. His eyes widened and a grin of delight spread across his face. James had no memory of his first visit to the old headquarters, but he knew from other people's descriptions how the doorway revealed itself the first time you arrived, how number 12 simply pushed numbers 11 and 13 aside like a man shouldering his way through a crowd. James couldn't help grinning back at Ralph's wonderment. "I love being a wizard," Ralph said meaningfully. As James slammed the door, his mum strode quickly toward him from the hall, wiping her hands on a towel. "James," she cried, gathering him into her arms and nearly yanking him off his feet. "Mum," James said, embarrassed and pleased. "Come on, you're gonna melt the chocolate frog in my shirt pocket already. You're not too old to give your mum a kiss after being gone for 4 months, you know," she chided him. "You know how it is," Ted exclaimed mournfully. "One moment, they're yanking your apron strings, the next, they're asking to borrow the broom to go snogging with some crumpet. Where does the time go?" James' mum grinned, turning to Ted and embracing him as well. "Ted, you never change." Or, "Shut up. Welcome. And you too, Victoire. Adorable hat, by the way." Ralph groaned, but James' mum went on before Victoire could offer any pointed explanation. "And you're Ralph, of course. Harry mentioned you, and of course, James has told me loads about you in his letters. My name's Ginny. I hear you are quite the wand master. Where is Dad, by the way?" James asked quickly, cutting Victoire off again. "He picked up Andromeda after work today. They should be home soon enough. Everyone else will be here tomorrow." James, 2 smaller voices chimed in unison, to the accompaniment of thundering footsteps. Fed. Victoire, Lily and Albus shoved past their mum. "What did you bring us?" Albus demanded, stopping in front of James. "Direct from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry," James said grandly, "I bring you both hugs." He grabbed Albus in a bear hug. Albus pushed and struggled, simultaneously laughing and annoyed. No. I wanted some Dribble's best blowing gum from the cart lady. I told you. Ted squatted down and squeezed Lily. I got you something you'll love, my dear. What is it? She asked, suddenly shy. You'll have to wait until Christmas, won't you? Your mummy's all stocked up on dragon kibble, isn't she? Ted, Lupin. Ginny snapped. Don't get her hopes up, you rogue. Now come on, all of you. Creature's been in the basement all afternoon, preparing what he calls a fitting and proper tea service. Don't fill up, though, or you'll not be hungry for the goose he cooked, and he'll sulk all week. Harry and Ted's grandmum, Andromeda Tonks, arrived half an hour later, and the rest of the evening was a whirlwind of food, happy laughter, and catching up. Harry and Ginny, it turned out, hadn't even listened to the Hogwarts debate, despite what James had assumed. Andromeda Tonks had, though, and was full of endless vitriol for Tabitha Corsica and her team. Fortunately, she had no idea whatsoever that Ralph had also been on the team, and Ralph was all too happy to allow her to continue in that ignorance. Don't worry, Ted murmured to Ralph over dessert, if anybody says anything, I'll tell her you were a spy operating undercover. She loves espionage, does the old dear. Creature hadn't changed a single iota. He bowed low to James, one hand over his heart, the other spread wide. Master James, come back from his first year of schooling, he warbled in his bullfrog voice. Creature has prepared Master's quarters just the way he likes them. Would Master and his friend care for a watercress sandwich? Creature had, as usual, kept the house in exceptional order, and had even gone to the trouble to decorate for the holidays. Unfortunately, Creature's concept of good cheer was a bit rustic, and the result would have amused Vane endlessly. The severed heads of the previous house elves, which still hung in the hallway as a testament to the original pure-blood owners of the estate, had been dressed with fake, white beards and conical, green caps with jingle bells on the tips. Creature had bewitched them to sing holiday songs, too, he did, Creature told James and Ralph a bit petulantly. But the missus decided that was perhaps a bit too festive. Creature liked it, though, just the same. He seemed to be angling to be allowed to reinstate the caroling heads. James assured Creature that it had been a wonderfully inventive idea and he'd talk to his mum about it. He was, in fact, morbidly curious to see and hear the heads in action. Both Lily and Albus followed James and Ralph around most of the night, begging to see what the boys could do with their newly learned skills. Come on, James. Albus demanded. Show us a levitation. Levitate, Lily. No. Lily cried. Levitate Albus. Fly him out the window. You both know I can't do magic once I'm off the train and officially out of Hogwarts, James said wearily. I'll get in trouble. Dad's head order, you get. You probably won't even get a warning. It's irresponsible, James said seriously. You get older and you'll know what that means. You can't do it, can you? Albus taunted. James can't do a levitation. Some wizard you are. First squib in the Potter family. Mum will die of shame. You're the same Albus Blabbus you ever were, you little scroot. Don't call me that. What, scroot or Albus Blabbus? James smiled. You know Albus Blabbus is your real name, don't you? It's on your birth certificate. I saw it. Albus Blabbus. Lily sang, dancing around her older brother. Albus jumped on James, wrestling him to the floor. Later, as James and Ralph headed to James' bedroom for the night, they passed a curtain that seemed to be drawn over a section of wall. A sleepy muttering came from behind it. Old Mrs. Black, James explained. Crazy old nutter. Wigs out about people desecrating the house of her fathers and stuff every time she sees any of us. Tad and Neville have done everything they could think of to get the old bat off the wall, but she's stuck there right good. Even considered cutting out the section of wall with the portrait on it, but it's a main wall. Cutting her out would probably bring the next floor right down on top of us. Besides, strange as it may seem, Creature's rather attached to her, since she was his old mistress. So I suppose she's part of the family forever. Ralph peeped tentatively behind the curtain. He furrowed his brow. Is she watching television? James shrugged. We discovered that a few years back. We had the front door open because we were moving in a new sofa. She saw a telly through the window across the street and shut right up for the first time in weeks. So we hired a wizard artist to come and paint one right into her portrait. Crazy old bat loves the chap shows. Ever since then, well, she's been a lot more bearable. Ralph slowly let the curtain drape back over the portrait. A man's voice behind it was saying, "And when did you first notice that your dog had Tourette's syndrome, Mrs. Drakemont?" Creature had arranged a cot for Ralph in James' room. His trunk was placed neatly at the end of it, and there was a ribbon-wrapped pine cone on each pillow, apparently Creature's idea of a Christmas mint. "This used to be my dad's godfather's room," James said sleepily, once they had settled down. "Cool," Ralph muttered. "Good guy, was he? Or was he a nutter, like the old witch in the portrait?" "One of the best guys ever, according to Dad. We'll have to tell you about him sometime. He was wanted for murder for over a decade." There was a minute of silence, and then Ralph's voice spoke in the darkness. "You wizards can be pretty bloody confusing, you know that." James grinned. A minute later, both of them were asleep.